Somewhere in southeastern Turkey, carved from limestone by hands that had never seen a city, never heard of a king, never written a single word down, there is a face. It stares out from the rock with an expression that's difficult to name. Not quite serene, not quite threatening, just present, watching, waiting maybe for someone to finally ask the right questions. That face is roughly 11,000 years old, and the moment you truly sit with that number, something shifts, because 11,000 years ago, according to the version of history most of us learned in school, people weren't supposed to be doing this yet. They were supposed to be wandering, hunting, gathering, surviving day to day without the kind of social organization it takes to carve a human face into stone and haul it somewhere intentional. They were supposed to be pre-civilization, pre-everything really. And yet, there it is. That's the thing about Karahan Tepe that gets under your skin. It doesn't fit neatly into the story we've been telling about ourselves. And the more archaeologists carefully, methodically dig into this hillside in the Tek Tek mountains, the more that story has to stretch to accommodate what's actually there. Not because anything mystical or unexplained is happening, but because the evidence, the stone, the carvings, the architecture, the animal bones and ash and carefully shaped enclosures, all of it is pointing towards something genuinely surprising about what early humans were capable of and why they chose to build at all. Before we go any further, let me just say where this is going and where it isn't. This episode is about Karahan Tepe specifically. What it is, what archaeologists have found there, what the leading interpretations are, and where genuine uncertainty still lives. We're going to follow the evidence carefully. When something is well established, I'll tell you. When something is a working hypothesis, I'll tell you that too. And when something is genuinely still unknown, we are going to sit with that rather than rush to fill the gap with a satisfying but unsupported answer. No ancient astronauts, no lost civilizations in the science fiction sense. Just a site that is strange and significant enough on its own terms that it doesn't need any of that. If you're listening to this right now, I want to know where you are and what time it is. Drop it in the comments, genuinely. There's something quietly remarkable about the fact that thousands of people are lying in the dark in completely different time zones, thinking about the same carved stone face from 11,000 years ago. Berlin at midnight, Melbourne at breakfast. Someone in a quiet suburb where it's just gone 2 in the morning and the house is finally still. That's its own kind of thing. Leave a comment. I read them. And if you'd like to listen without any ads, without any background music, just the story in the quiet, you can follow this show on Spotify. The link is in the description. It supports the work directly, and honestly, for sleep listening, it's the cleaner experience. Now, back to that face. The question at the center of this episode isn't just what is Karahan Tepe, though we'll answer that thoroughly. The deeper question is something that archaeologists have been wrestling with ever since sites like this started emerging from the soil. What were monumental ritual spaces for before there were cities? Before there were kings to commission them, priests to administrate them, or farmers with a grain surplus to fund them? What were people doing, and why did it matter enough to invest enormous amounts of coordinated labor into shaping stone and space in the middle of nowhere, on a hillside, in a world that we thought was too early for that kind of organized intention? That question doesn't have a single clean answer, but it has several very good ones, built carefully from evidence that are reshaping how we understand the deep roots of human society. And Karahan Tepe sits right at the center of that reshaping. Here's what we can say with confidence right now. Karahan Tepe is a Neolithic site in what is now southern Turkey, in the same broader landscape as Göbekli Tepe, which you may already know as the site that rewrote the textbooks on early human architecture. The two sites share similarities deep enough to suggest they were part of the same cultural world. But Karahan Tepe is not simply a copy. It has its own character, its own carved figures, its own architectural logic, and features that don't appear anywhere else in the archaeological record. In some ways it's even stranger than its famous neighbour. Serious excavation at Karahan Tepe only began in 2019. Led by Dr. Necmi Karul from Istanbul University, under the auspices of the Turkish Ministry of Culture and Tourism. That means we are genuinely early in the process of understanding this place. Some of what we think we know will almost certainly be revised as more ground is opened. That's not a reason for skepticism about what's been found. It's a reason to hold interpretations a little loosely and stay curious about where the evidence leads next. What has already been found is remarkable by any standard. Massive T-shaped pillars, an extraordinary room filled with carved stone heads emerging directly from the bedrock, figures that blur the line between human and animal. A structure unlike anything else known from this period, shaped in ways that suggest deliberate, considered, repeated use over a long span of time. Evidence of feasting, evidence of water management, evidence, perhaps, of the way early humans understood death and ancestry, and the relationship between the living and those who came before. All of that in a place built by people who, as far as we can tell, did not live there permanently, who came from somewhere else for reasons that mattered enough to make the journey, and who left behind a landscape so carefully shaped that 11,000 years later, it still organizes the space around it. The approach we're going to take here is straightforward. We start with the physical evidence, what's actually in the ground, what it looks like, how it was made, how it was used. Then we move to interpretation, what archaeologists think it might mean and why. Then we sit with the open questions, the things nobody can say yet, and maybe a few things that nobody is entirely sure how to ask. That ordering matters, because a site like this attracts a lot of theories, some careful, some not, and the only way to sort between them is to keep the evidence clearly in view. So let's start at the beginning. Not the beginning of Karahan Tepe's discovery, though we'll get there. The beginning in the sense of place. Where on this planet does a site like this appear, and what does that landscape tell us before we've even looked at a single carved stone? If you look at a map of southeastern Turkey, somewhere between the Euphrates to the west and the Tigris curving down toward Iraq in the east, you find a region called the Harran Plain. It's a wide, flat basin, dusty in summer, cold in winter, edged on its northern and eastern sides by low limestone ridges and rocky plateaus. This is the upper end of what geographers call the fertile crescent, though the word fertile can be a little misleading. It's not lush, it's a landscape of extremes, of seasonal abundance and long dry stretches, of sudden storms and months without rain. But it sits at a kind of geographic crossroads that has drawn human attention for a very long time, and roughly 35 kilometers northeast of the modern city of Şanlıurfa, on a series of rocky limestone hillsides in the Tek Tek mountains, is where you find Karahan Tepe. The name translates roughly as Black Hill, or Hill of the Black Stone. It's a modest name for what's there. The site itself sits on a natural bedrock outcrop, the kind of elevated position that gives you sight lines in multiple directions, that puts you above the flat ground without putting you so high that the climb becomes impractical. From the right vantage point, you can see the steppe stretching out below, interrupted by dry stream beds and the occasional shimmer of a seasonal water source. It's the kind of place that would have made immediate practical sense to people reading a landscape the way their lives depended on it. But Karahan Tepe doesn't sit alone. And this is something worth pausing on, because it changes the entire interpretive picture. Within roughly a 200-kilometer radius of Karahan Tepe, archaeologists have now identified more than a dozen sites that appear to belong to the same cultural tradition, the same broad period, and in many cases the same architectural vocabulary. Göbekli Tepe is the most famous of them, sitting about 35 kilometers to the northwest. But there's also Taştepeler, which is both the name for one specific site and the name Turkish archaeologists have given to this entire cluster, this network of related Neolithic sites, spreading across the plateaus and valleys of this corner of Anatolia. Karahan Tepe is one node in something larger. It is connected, geographically and almost certainly culturally, to a landscape that was being shaped and used and returned to by people over an enormous span of time. That landscape deserves some description, because landscape is never neutral when you're trying to understand why people built where they built. The Tek Tek mountains aren't dramatic peaks. They're worn-down limestone formations, ridged and fissured, cut through by seasonal watercourses that fill after rain and go quiet in summer. The plateau edges offer natural promontories. The valleys between them channel movement, the way water moves, the way animals move, the way people move when they're traveling on foot between one place and another. You don't have to impose meaning on a geography like this. The geography imposes itself. The steppe vegetation of the region, the grasses and legumes and wild cereals, would have supported significant wildlife populations during the early Holocene. Gazelle, wild cattle, wild boar, birds in migration, the kind of resources that would pull mobile hunting groups back to the same territories in reliable seasonal cycles. And seasonal return is important here, because the leading picture of who was using these sites is not one of settled villagers living permanently on the hillside. It's one of groups that moved through this landscape, returned to certain places, and invested those places with meaning that accumulated over generations. The routes that connect these sites to each other and to the lowlands and river valleys further out follow the natural corridors of the terrain. Ridge lines, dry valleys, the logical paths that emerge when you move on foot through broken country and need to find water, avoid dead ends, and stay oriented. Several of the Tash Tepe sites cluster near locations where seasonal springs or cisterns would have been viable, and Karahan Tepe itself sits near sources of water that would have been critical for any large gathering. Water shapes everything in an arid steppe environment. Where water appears, people follow. Where people follow with enough regularity, meaning starts to accumulate. This brings us to what archaeologists have started calling a ritual landscape. Not one temple, not one isolated monument dropped into an empty countryside, but a distributed network of special places, spread across a region, connected by physical routes and probably by shared cultural practice, shared stories, shared reasons for coming and returning. Think of it less like a cathedral standing alone in a field, and more like a set of sacred sites spread across a region that people navigated between over the course of a year or a lifetime. The landscape itself was organized. The individual sites were nodes in something relational. That concept, the ritual landscape, is an interpretive framework, not a proven fact, and it's worth being clear about that. But it's grounded in the spatial distribution of the sites themselves, in the similarities of their architecture and carved imagery, and in what we understand about how mobile and semi-mobile groups typically relate to significant places. It's a working model with real evidence behind it, and it shapes the questions archaeologists are asking at Karahan Tepe now. Now, when did all of this happen? The broad answer is that Karahan Tepe was in active use somewhere in the range of 11,000 to 9,500 years ago, which places it in a transitional period that geologists call the boundary between the late Younger Dryas and the early Holocene. The Younger Dryas was a sharp, cold, dry period that interrupted the warming trend after the last ice age. It ended roughly 11,700 years ago, quite abruptly by geological standards, and what followed was a climate shift toward warmer, wetter and more stable conditions across much of the Near East. This shift mattered enormously for human populations. It opened up new opportunities. It changed which plants grew where, which animals moved through which territories, which landscapes became suddenly more hospitable than they had been for centuries. The people using Karahan Tepe were living right in the middle of that transition. They were hunter-gatherers, or something very close to it, though the boundary between hunting and gathering and the earliest forms of plant management is itself blurry and contested in this period. What we can say is that there is no evidence of full agricultural villages at Karahan Tepe, no grain storage facilities, no domesticated crop remains in the proportion you'd expect from farming communities. The populations using this site were not, as far as current evidence tells us, feeding themselves primarily from cultivated fields, and that is the puzzle at the heart of the whole site. Because what they were building requires something extraordinary, moving and shaping limestone blocks that weigh multiple tons, carving detailed figures and faces into bedrock with stone tools, organizing and maintaining structures over what appears to be a very long period of repeated use. All of that demands coordinated labor. It demands that enough people show up in the same place with enough shared intention to do work that none of them could do alone. It demands planning across time, across seasons, probably across generations. It demands, in other words, a level of social organization that the older models of prehistory associated almost exclusively with settled agricultural societies. The traditional story ran something like this. First, people farmed. Farming created surplus. Surplus created the time and resources for specialization. Specialization created priests and administrators and monument builders. Monuments came after. Civilization came after. Everything we recognize as complex social organization was downstream of agriculture. Karahan Tepe, along with Göbekli Tepe and the other Taş Tepeler sites, is putting real pressure on that sequence. Because here is monumental architecture, here are complex carved symbols and figures, here is evidence of large-scale gathering and feasting and deliberate spatial organization, all appearing among people who were not yet, or not fully, agricultural. Which means either the story of how civilization develops is more complicated than the simple farming first model allows, or the people building these sites were further along the path towards sedentism and food production than we've yet been able to confirm. Probably both things are partly true, and working out which parts and in what combination is a significant part of what current excavations at Karahan Tepe are trying to establish. What's already clear is that this landscape, these plateaus, these seasonal water sources, these ridgelines connecting valley to valley, was not an accidental backdrop for what happened here. The geography was part of the logic, the visibility, the access routes, the convergence of different seasonal territories. All of it made this a place that made sense to return to, a place worth the effort, a place where the labor of shaping stone into something meaningful could draw people from a wide surrounding region. The landscape didn't create the culture that built Karahan Tepe, but it gave that culture somewhere coherent to land. And on that hillside, 11,000 years ago, people landed. They came back, they carved, and eventually they left something behind that we're still not entirely sure how to read. Karahan Tepe didn't arrive on the archaeological stage the way it might sound when you see it in a headline, as if one day someone brushed away a bit of soil and there it was, a Neolithic stone head staring back in high definition. Its path into focus was slower, more incremental, a story of people noticing oddities in the landscape long before anyone had a clear sense of what they were looking at. Local shepherds and villagers knew there were worked stones on that hill. That's almost always how it begins. Weathered blocks, fragments that don't quite look natural, the sense that something underfoot has edges too straight for geology alone. In the late 20th century, surveys in the Şanlıurfa region recorded Karahan Tepe as one of those promising spots. Not a full excavation, just a note on a map, a brief description, concentrations of flint, fragments of stone architecture, possible Neolithic site. Göbekli Tepe's rise to international attention in the 1990s changed the context. Once archaeologists realized there was an 11,000-year-old monumental site sitting under a rounded hill near Urfa, the logic of the surrounding landscape shifted. Those earlier promising notes became more than just background. They became potential pieces of a wider pattern. Karahan Tepe was one of the places that suddenly mattered more. Repeat surveys in the 1990s and 2000s started to refine the picture. Surface collections picked up characteristic flint tools and fragments of T-shaped pillars, the same basic architectural vocabulary that defined Göbekli Tepe. The site was clearly substantial, but it still sat mostly quiet, its secrets protected by meters of accumulated soil and deliberate fill. Systematic excavations began in earnest in the late 2010s, under the direction of Turkish archaeologists as part of the broader Taş Tepeler initiative. That timeline is worth keeping in mind. For a place that was last used more than 9,000 years ago, modern work on Karahan Tepe is still in its early stages. We're not dealing with a site that has been peeled back and reinterpreted for a century. We're dealing with something that has had only a handful of seasons of sustained, targeted digging and excavation, even when it sounds like a straightforward act of uncovering, is not simple revelation. It's controlled destruction. Once you remove a layer of soil, once you lift a stone, once you take an artifact out of its original position, you can't put it back. That's why archaeologists move slowly, and why the first thing they tend to talk about isn't the spectacular object, but the context it came from. Karahan Tepe has deep stratigraphy, stacked layers of human activity, natural deposition, and, critically, intentional backfill. When you see the famous images of the carved human heads emerging from the bedrock chamber, you're only looking at a tiny exposed window into a much larger structure that is still mostly encased. That small opening is the result of carefully removing overlying material in order, layer by layer, recording everything as it's dismantled. What can excavation reveal at a site like this? It can show the sequence of building and rebuilding. It can tell you which walls cut into which floors, which pits were dug before which enclosures, where fire was repeatedly lit and where it almost never was. It can show you that a T-shaped pillar was set into a carved socket, adjusted, and then wedged with smaller stones. It can show you that a basin was smoothed and re-smoothed over years of use. It can't give you a transcript of what people said when they stood in those spaces. It can't, on its own, tell you what every carved symbol meant to the people who made it. It can't give you a single, final answer about what the site was for without weaving in analogy, comparison, and a lot of cautious inference. So a huge amount of effort goes into documentation. Before anything is removed, the area is mapped in detail. At Karahan Tepe, that means georeferenced plans, digital models, and old-fashioned measured drawings. Every stone that looks like it was placed by human hands gets recorded. Its size, orientation, relationship to neighbouring stones, and the layer it sits in. If a pillar fragment is found tilted in the fill, the angle matters. It might tell you whether it fell in place, was pushed over, or was reused as packing material. Stratigraphic layers are described one by one. Texture, colour, composition, inclusions. Is this a collapsed wall layer, full of angular stones and crumbly mortar? Is it a trampled surface, rich in tiny flint chips and bone fragments? Is it a deliberately poured fill, homogeneous and compact, brought in from outside to bury a structure? At Karahan Tepe, that question of deliberate infill is central, because so many of the enclosures appear to have been intentionally buried at the end of their use. Tool marks on the bedrock and on shaped stones are logged as well. Parallel grooves can show where stone axes or picks were used to carve channels. Smooth patches can indicate long-term wear from feet or water or repeated handling. Tiny details like the direction of chisel lines can reveal how carvers approached a surface, where they stood, and in what order they worked. All of this gets tied to context numbers, grid squares, elevations. When an animal bone comes out of a specific layer on the floor of an enclosure, its precise location isn't trivia. It might later help date that phase, or indicate what kinds of activities took place there. When a fragment of carved limestone is found in the backfill of a later pit, that tells a story about reuse and the afterlife of older structures. From the inside, the language used to describe all of this is dry, technical, and full of qualifiers. From the outside, what the public often sees are headlines. World's oldest cult center. Skull cult temple discovered. Stone heads from 11,000 years ago stun experts. The gap between those two registers is enormous. Archaeologists working at Karahan Tepe know that they're dealing with something extraordinary in chronological terms. They also know how easy it is to overpromise, especially in the early years of excavation when the exposed sample of the site is small and partial. So formal publications and conference presentations tend to be cautious. Phrases like possible ritual use, interpreted as provisionally dated to, appear again and again. The language is slow because the evidence is still accumulating. Media outlets, on the other hand, need quick, digestible narratives. A partially excavated enclosure with benches and a central pillar becomes a temple. A carved human head becomes part of a cult of ancestors. Those might not be wrong directions, but they're far more definite than the data really allows at this stage. This isn't a complaint about interest. Public attention helps fund work. It creates space for long-term projects. But it does mean that any firm story you hear right now about Karahan Tepe should be held lightly, with an awareness that it rests on a sample of the site that is far from complete. Because here is one of the most important facts about Karahan Tepe. Most of it is still buried. Remote sensing, surface mapping, and the visible contours of the mound all indicate that the area currently open in excavation trenches is just a fraction of the total. The stone head chamber that has captured so much attention is only one feature in a cluster. To the sides and below, geophysical surveys suggest additional walls, enclosures, and carved elements still sealed under fill. What this implies is that our current picture is not just incomplete, it's structurally biased. We're seeing the parts that were easiest or most strategic to open first, not a random cross-section. Future seasons may reveal additional enclosures with very different layouts. They may uncover domestic-like areas, storage zones, or activity spaces that complicate a simple temple complex reading. They may find evidence for episodes of rebuilding that stretch the chronology of use in unexpected ways. Early interpretations almost always shift under this kind of pressure. Göbekli Tepe is a good example. Initial work there in the late 1990s encouraged a view of isolated circular temples on an otherwise unused hilltop. As more of the site was exposed, the picture became more layered. Different phases of construction and infilling, smaller rectangular buildings, areas that look more like everyday working spaces appearing alongside the monumental architecture. The story didn't collapse. It became more interesting, more complex, less easy to summarize in a single sentence. The same is almost certainly going to happen at Karahan Tepe. The first wave of publications has necessarily focused on the spectacular, the bedrock chamber with its row of phallic stone projections and the human head rising from the floor, the T-shaped pillars, the carefully carved benches. Those features are real. They're not going to disappear. But how we understand them, what kinds of gatherings they belonged to, what sequences of use and closure they participated in, will likely evolve as the exagation area expands and as the more mundane, less photogenic parts of the site are brought into the conversation. For now, Karahan Tepe is a collection of carefully exposed windows into a much larger buried architecture. Through those windows we can already see hints of planning, repetition, and symbolic investment. The job of the modern dig is to widen those windows without distorting what lies beyond them, to build a narrative that can flex and adjust as new walls, new floors, and new carved faces slowly come into the light. If most of Karahan Tepe is still buried, how do we even know how old it is? We don't have inscriptions, no foundation plaque saying year 3 of King whoever, no pottery with well-dated styles. Karahan Tepe belongs to what archaeologists in this region call the pre-pottery Neolithic, and that label already tells you the first big absence. No ceramics, no nice, easily classifiable bowls and jars to hang dates on. So instead, dating becomes a kind of forensic science. You're trying to build a timeline out of things that were never meant to be clocks. The main tool is radiocarbon dating, not of the stone, but of the fragile organic material tucked into the same layers as the stone architecture. When a plant or an animal is alive, it has a certain ratio of radioactive carbon-14 to normal carbon. When it dies, that carbon-14 starts to decay at a predictable rate. Measure how much is left, you get an age, at least in theory. In practice, at a place like Karahan Tepe, you're almost never dating the monument directly. You're dating what people did around it. Charcoal from a hearth built up against a wall, a burnt seed in the compacted floor next to a pillar, a fragment of bone from an animal butchered in the same use layer as the carved heads. Archaeologists take tiny samples, often just slivers of charcoal, and send them to specialized labs. The results come back not as a single number but as a range. So many years before present, with a statistical probability curve. That curve then has to be calibrated against known fluctuations in atmospheric carbon over time. The end product is something like, with 95% probability, this sample dates to between 9,600 and 9,200 BCE. Now imagine dozens of those dates, each tied very precisely to a specific layer or feature. One from the fill under a bench, one from ash inside a fire pit, one from a trampled surface that runs through an enclosure. Alone, each date is just a band of uncertainty. Together, layered the way they were laid down in the soil, they start to sketch a chronology. But radiocarbon is only one part of the picture. The other big piece is relative dating, working out what came before what. Here stratigraphy becomes your first language. If a wall cuts through an earlier floor, the wall is younger. If a pillar base is sunk into a prepared pit, and that pit slices through an older deposit, the pillar phase comes after whatever activity created that earlier layer. If a series of benches are built against a pre-existing ring of orthostats, you've got at least two architectural moments. Archaeologists at Karahan Tepe spend a lot of time drawing these relationships as simple diagrams. Lines for walls, shaded areas for floors, arrows for cuts through. That diagram might look abstract, but it's really a time map. It tells you that enclosure A had at least three major phases: initial construction, use and modification, and then intentional burial. Tool styles add another set of clues. The flint points, scrapers, and blades scattered through the layers at Karahan Tepe belong to a technological tradition we recognize from across the region. Certain point shapes, ways of preparing cores, methods of blade production all match what's known from early and middle pre-pottery Neolithic sites in southeastern Anatolia and northern Mesopotamia. When you find the same toolkit made in the same way, in datable contexts across multiple sites, you start to be confident that you're dealing with roughly the same slice of time. And then there's architecture itself. The big T-shaped pillars, the arrangement of enclosures, the way benches hug the walls, all resonate strongly with what we see at Göbekli Tepe and other Taş Tepeler sites that have their own radiocarbon series. No one is arguing that Karahan is a copy of Göbekli, but they clearly speak a shared architectural language. That shared grammar is another anchor, tying Karahan Tepe into the broader pre-pottery Neolithic world. All of this sounds neat and orderly when described from a distance. In reality, the ground refuses to cooperate. Charcoal samples might not be from the moment you think. There's what archaeologists call the old wood problem. If someone in the Neolithic cut down a tree that had already been alive for a few hundred years, burned the wood, and left charcoal in a hearth next to a pillar, the radiocarbon date you get is not the date the fire was lit. It's the date the tree stopped growing. You might overshoot the real activity by centuries. Deposits also get mixed. Burrowing animals, later human visitors, roots pushing through layers, even water movement can disturb sediments. A charcoal fragment can migrate down into an older layer. A bone can be dragged up into a younger one. When you get a radiocarbon date that doesn't fit the sequence, a suspiciously old date sitting above younger ones, or vice versa, you have to ask whether the sample has moved, whether the layer was already a jumble when it formed. Later disturbance adds another layer of complexity. Karahan Tepe isn't frozen in time. After its main use phases, people came back. They dug pits, they robbed stones, they may have reused parts of the mound in ways we don't fully understand. Islamic period graves have been found at Göbekli Tepe. Similar late intrusions are possible here too. Every later cut, every intrusive feature, is a chance for older material to be redeposited in younger contexts. This is why archaeologists are cautious about over-precision. When you see 11,000-year-old stone heads in a headline, it's not based on a calendar date, constructed on Tuesday, September whatever, 9600 BCE, at 3:14 in the afternoon. It's a shorthand for a broad window of time. Most of the radiocarbon evidence so far places the main monumental phase of Karahan Tepe somewhere in the early pre-pottery Neolithic, broadly within the same early Holocene horizon as Göbekli Tepe's big enclosures. Think roughly between 9600 and 9000 BCE, give or take a few centuries in each direction. Different features may nudge toward the earlier or later end of that band. Later use or reworking might stretch activity at the mound down into the 8th millennium BCE, but around 11,000 years ago is a fair, round number way of situating the site in the public imagination. That round number is doing a lot of work. It tells you that Karahan Tepe belongs to a world before pottery, before metal, before cities, before formal writing systems of any kind. A world in which domestication of plants and animals is just beginning to take hold, unevenly, region by region. A world brushing up against the end of the Younger Dryas, the last sharp cold snap before the climate settles into the relatively stable warmth of the Holocene. And this is where dating stops being just a technical exercise and starts to matter for the bigger story. Once you place Karahan Tepe in that early Holocene window, You can line it up with independent climate records, lake cores, cave stalagmites, glacial melt histories. You can see that people were carving these pillars and sculpting these heads in a landscape that was becoming greener, wetter, more forgiving than the one their immediate ancestors knew. Grasslands were expanding, wild herds were flourishing, new plant communities were appearing. At the same time, you can connect it to broader social transitions. Sites across the Levant and Anatolia show signs of increasing sedentism. People staying longer in one place, experimenting with cultivation, intensifying their use of particular patches of land. The pre-pottery Neolithic is when we see the first sustained investment in built environments. Stone architecture that isn't just a seasonal shelter, but a statement that this place matters. Karahan Tepe, on current evidence, sits right inside that hinge moment. Not at the beginning of everything human, not at the birth of agriculture in some absolute sense, but in a phase where climate, resources, and social organization were all shifting fast. The dates, imperfect as they are, tell us we're looking at a community, or probably a network of communities that decided to cut, haul, and shape enormous stones, dig deep chambers into bedrock, and repeat distinctive architectural forms over generations, all before pottery, before metal, and likely before fully domesticated wheat or barley were stable parts of the local economy. In the sections ahead, when we talk about the stone heads, the T-shaped pillars, the benches, and the possible feasting and gatherings at Karahan Tepe, that temporal context is the backdrop. These weren't Bronze Age kings. They weren't farmers in walled towns. They were people living through one of the great climate and social turning points of the last 20,000 years. Dating doesn't give us their names or their myths, but it does tell us where in the long human story to look for them, and what other changes were unfolding in the same centuries that they were carving faces out of stone and setting them into the living rock. When people talk about Karahan Tepe, they almost always end up back at the same images. Not the radiocarbon dates, not the stratigraphic diagrams, but the stone faces and bodies emerging from the bedrock. Because for all the abstraction of pre-pottery Neolithic ritual architecture, it's hard to stay abstract when you're staring at a carved human head, chin jutting out of the floor, sightless eyes fixed on a space that was once full of living people. Let's start with what is actually there. In one of the most talked about spaces at Karahan Tepe, a long, narrow chamber has been cut directly into the natural rock. Running along its axis, emerging from the bedrock itself, are a line of carved stone heads, not full statues hauled in and set down, but the rock of the hills shaped into necks and faces that seem to rise from the ground. They're not realistic portraits. Think stylized, simplified. The craniums are rounded, the faces are elongated. Noses are clearly defined, often strong and projecting. Mouths can be indicated as a shallow groove, or sometimes left ambiguous. The eyes are usually suggested rather than fully modelled, more like hollows or incised depressions than anatomically detailed orbs. They're not tiny trinkets. Some of these heads are human scale or slightly larger, big enough that if you were standing close, your own face would be not so different in size. Others are smaller, more like busts embedded in the architecture. What unites them is their integration with the space. They're not independent objects you could pick up and carry away. They are the room. Carving-wise, they sit in an interesting place between rough-hewn and carefully finished. You can still read the blows of stone tools in the facets of the cheeks or the curve of a skull. At the same time, it's obvious this wasn't casual doodling. The sculptors understood the stone, exploited natural planes and fracture lines, and brought out recognizable forms with surprising economy of detail. In some cases, heads appear in relation to more complete bodies. Karahan Tepe has produced carved human figures in high relief, including a striking upright male figure with strongly emphasized neck and shoulders, and clearly indicated sex. The style again is not naturalistic in the modern Western art sense. Limbs can be tubular, torsos smooth, muscles simplified into bulges and ridges, but there is an insistence on certain elements. The curve of the back, the angle of the shoulders, the relationship between head and body. Scale matters here. These are not tiny amulets tucked into a pocket. When bodies appear, they're often close to life size, or at least large enough to register as corporeal presences in a room. The upright male figure, for example, isn't towering like a colossal statue, but it stands at a height that would put its carved face somewhere around chest or shoulder level for an adult human standing near it. Intimate, not overwhelming. Placement is just as important as form. Those bedrock heads don't float randomly in space. They're aligned, oriented, repeating along the axis of a carefully shaped chamber. The carved bodies, where we have good context, are positioned in relation to architectural features. Thresholds, benches, pillar zones. One head projects from a wall at a height that would have put it directly into the sightline of anyone entering the space. Others are low, forcing your awareness down toward the floor. This choreography of gaze and movement is one of the clearest things we can say. Whoever planned these rooms thought hard about how people would move, where they would look, how stone faces would intersect with human bodies. Technically, the work sits comfortably within the broader tool tradition of the time. There's no evidence of metal chisels or exotic techniques. Everything we see could be done with flint and hard hammerstones, pecking, grinding, smoothing. If anything, the sophistication lies less in raw carving skill and more in the conceptual step, deciding to turn living rock into enduring human semblances at this scale, in these positions. What do they mean? This is where the ground gets softer. We can list possibilities, but each one is a hypothesis, not a solved puzzle. One cautious reading is personhood. In many societies, giving something a face is a way of recognizing it as a kind of person, even if it's not a literal human individual. The carved heads could be embodiments of someone or something that mattered, not necessarily portraits of named individuals, but presences with roles. They might be ancestors, not in the strict genealogical sense of this is great-grandmother so-and-so, but as condensed figures standing in for a remembered past. In communities without writing, without archives or photographs, faces and bodies carved into stone are one way to make the idea of those who came before tangible, visible, anchored to a place. They might be mythic beings, creatures from origin stories, culture heroes, beings associated with landforms or animals. If Karahan Tepe was a place where stories about the world were told and retold, populating the architecture with carved figures would weave those stories directly into the walls. They could even function as symbolic guardians. Setting watchful faces at thresholds or around focal spaces is a pattern we see in many later traditions. At Karahan Tepe, heads built into the architecture might have framed a boundary between ordinary ground and a space of heightened meaning. What we do not know is just as important. We don't know their names. No inscriptions tell us, this is so-and-so, lord of this or that, remembered for these deeds. We don't know if each head was meant to be a distinct individual or if they were intentionally generic, a repeated type of figure meant to evoke a category rather than a person. We can't say with confidence whether the people who carved them thought of them as alive in any sense, or simply as powerful images. We can't map a fixed meaning onto each placement. Was this line of heads a procession? A council? A set of witnesses? All of those analogies come from much later and very different cultural contexts. Comparisons with nearby sites can help set a frame, but they also show variation. At Göbekli Tepe, for example, you also get human-like representation. Some of the big T-shaped pillars carry low-relief human arms and hands, turning the entire pillar into a sort of abstracted anthropomorphic figure. There are also separate sculptures, human heads, sometimes separated from their bodies, animal-human hybrids, and ambiguous beings. Other Taş Tepeler sites show smaller figurines, carved heads that may have been detachable, and a general interest in human and animal forms. Across the pre-pottery Neolithic of this region, the theme of representing human-like beings is clearly present. But Karahan Tepe's bedrock heads and integrated bodies are distinctive in how they lock human form into the very skeleton of the site. At Göbekli, pillars can be removed, repurposed, re-erected. At Karahan Tepe, once you carve a face out of the living rock of a chamber, that face is tied to that chamber unless you literally destroy the space. This brings us to social memory. In a world without written records, how do you remember who you are across generations? How do you keep track of alliances, of origins, of obligations that extend beyond the living members of your group? One answer is architecture that carries memory. Not just walls and roofs, but walls and roofs populated by faces. A carved head is a durable mnemonic. Children can be told, "This is where we speak to those who were here before us." Elders can point, "This place belongs to such and such people. Their faces are in the stone." Stories can be attached to specific figures. When you stand between these two heads, remember the time when you don't need a literal one-to-one mapping of head to individual for this to work. The power lies in repetition. Every time people gathered in these chambers, every time someone ran their hand along a stone nose or glanced at a line of faces while listening to a story, the association between place, people, and past would deepen. The stone doesn't preserve the stories themselves. Those are gone. But the choice to fill a chamber with carved human forms, to make human representation a central theme of the architecture, hints that memory and identity were at stake here. These weren't just decorative touches on otherwise functional structures. They were part of how space was made meaningful, part of how groups with no archives, no written chronicles, and no monumental inscriptions could still create a deep, shared sense of we, anchored in rock and face and body. And those same carved beings lead us straight into the next layer of the site's language, the T-shaped pillars themselves, and the strange, consistent grammar with which they are arranged. If the carved heads and bodies at Karahan Tepe are the words that feel most human to us, the T-shaped pillars are the grammar that keeps showing up across the whole region. Strip them down to basics and the form is simple: a vertical shaft, a horizontal block set on top. Together they make a giant stone T. No faces, no legs, just that clean, abstract profile. What's striking is how consistent that profile is once it appears. At Karahan Tepe, Göbekli Tepe, and several of the other Taş Tepeler sites, you see the same basic formula: tall limestone monoliths, roughly rectangular in cross-section, with a clearly defined crossbar at the top. Heights and proportions differ from enclosure to enclosure, and from site to site, but the underlying idea holds: a standing stone with a head that projects. This isn't random boulders propped up because they happen to be handy. It's a repeated type, a form that people recognized, reproduced, and arranged in patterned ways. Now, what was that form supposed to be? Here's where that line between description and interpretation matters. One influential reading, based mostly on Göbekli Tepe but applicable here, is that these T-pillars are stylized human figures. At Göbekli, some of the big T's clearly carry carved arms, hands, belts, and even loincloths in low relief along their sides. When you see those, it's hard not to read the upright shaft as a torso, the crossbar as shoulders, the whole thing as a standing being. Karahan Tepe's pillars, as far as current excavation shows, are generally less lavishly decorated. We don't yet have the same density of carved arms on pillar edges that Göbekli has made famous, but the basic geometry is there, and some pillars do carry incised lines, abstract motifs, or shallow reliefs. A few hint at that same body plan. Vertical as trunk, horizontal as upper body. Still, they are people is an interpretation, not a proven fact. They could be person-like. They could be markers of presence, embodiments of something that is not strictly human but is someone in the cosmology of the builders. They could even stand in for multiple categories at once: ancestors, protective beings, mythic figures, all condensed into a single standardized outline. What we can say is that the T-shape gives these stones a kind of latent anthropomorphism. Even if no arms are carved, a column with a horizontal top just reads differently to a human eye than a pure post. It suggests direction, orientation, an implied front and back. And that might be the point, because once you have this repeatable, semi-anthropomorphic pillar form, you can start arranging them in systematic ways. You can give them roles in space. At Karahan Tepe, T-shaped pillars appear in more than one context. Some anchor circular or oval enclosures. Others stand in more linear or clustered arrangements. We see central pairs. We see perimeter rings. We see solitary pillars paired with benches or thresholds. Every time, there's a sense that somebody was working with a known vocabulary. Two big pillars in the center, smaller ones around. Pillars aligned along this axis. This kind of pillar in this kind of space. This is what archaeologists sometimes call a monumental grammar, not grammar in the linguistic sense of verbs and nouns, but in the sense of rules about what can go where, what combinations are meaningful, and what feels right to repeat. That grammar extends beyond Karahan Tepe itself. Göbekli Tepe has the famous circle enclosures, each with a pair of massive central T-pillars facing each other, surrounded by smaller Ts embedded in the walls. At Karahan, the arrangements are not carbon copies, but the family resemblance is clear. There are enclosures with dominant pillars, subordinate pillars, and an emphasis on facing, orientation, and symmetry. Other Tash Tepeler sites show variants again, more modest Ts, fewer carved details, different wall constructions, but the underlying gesture, set up T-shaped monoliths, organize space around them, keeps recurring. This suggests we're not looking at a single site's eccentricity. We're seeing a regional architectural tradition, a shared ritual language expressed in stone. Standardized forms are powerful for that. If everyone in your wider world recognizes a T-pillar as a particular kind of being, or a marker of a particular kind of space, you can walk into a gathering place 100 kilometers from home and still understand the basic layout. You might not know the local stories or specific taboos, but you'll know which area feels central, which side feels peripheral, where focus is directed. In a world of small, scattered groups, that kind of shared monumental vocabulary could help knit communities together. Different bands or clans might come to sites like Karahan Tepe from surrounding areas, bringing their own customs, but recognizing the T-pillars as part of a wider cosmos they all inhabit. At the same time, we need to be careful not to flatten everything into Göbekli Tepe. But here, Karahan Tepe is not just Göbekli with a different postal code. For one thing, the integration with bedrock is more radical at Karahan. While Göbekli's enclosures are built up with carefully fitted stones and freestanding monoliths, Karahan leans heavily on spaces carved into the hill itself, with pillars sometimes emerging from cut rock surroundings. The carving repertoire is also different. Göbekli is dense with animal reliefs, foxes, snakes, birds, wild boar, all crowding the surfaces of the big pillars. Karahan, at least in the currently excavated areas, seems more focused on human and abstract forms, with animal imagery present but less overwhelming. Even when both sites use T-pillars, their sentences are not the same. The way those pillars interact with benches, ramps, channels, and carved bodies at Karahan hints at a slightly different ritual choreography, even if we can't yet reconstruct it in detail. And then there's the sheer fact of what we're looking at. Large, shaped monoliths in a world that, as far as we can tell, did not yet have permanent stone-built towns. These people were still mostly living in small, probably semi-mobile communities, using perishable materials, wood, reeds, mud, for everyday shelters. Yet in certain places, they committed to hauling multi-ton limestone blocks, squaring them, setting them upright, and organizing entire landscapes around them. That choice pushes us to rethink some comfortable stories about civilization. In the classic narrative, you get agriculture first, then permanent villages, then cities, and only then, once you have stable surpluses and social hierarchies, do you start building big labor-intensive monuments. The T-pillars at Karahan Tepe and its sister sites flip that order on its head. Here, monumentality appears early, before pottery, before clear evidence of dense, year-round urban settlements, before the kind of bureaucratic apparatus we usually imagine marshalling large workforces. So what does it mean to build with stone at that scale, in that context? It suggests that the desire, or perhaps the perceived need, to create durable, shared ritual spaces can arise even in societies that are not yet civilized in the textbook sense. That coordination, planning, and sustained collective effort can be organized around gatherings, feasts, stories, and ancestors just as effectively as around kings and palaces. The T-shaped pillars are part of that story. They are not just inert slabs. They are the recurring signs that mark out these places as special, as different from daily life. They are the consistent characters in a landscape of ritual that stretches across hills and valleys. Stand among them, and even if we've lost the original scripts, you can still feel that you're in the middle of a sentence written in limestone, using a grammar we're only beginning to sound out. And once you pay attention to that grammar, another layer comes into focus. What these pillars share with other carved forms at the site, from overtly phallic stones to fully embodied figures, and how bodily imagery, human and otherwise, was woven into the architecture of gathering. Once you start noticing the bodily hints in the T-pillars, it becomes harder to ignore some of the more explicit stones at Karahan Tepe, because not all of the uprights here are abstract. Some are unmistakably, deliberately phallic. We're talking about vertical, rounded shafts carved out of, or left standing within, the bedrock. In the so-called pillar pool area, for example, there's a cluster of short, rounded pillars emerging from the carved floor, tightly packed, with smooth tops and clear separation between each element. They're not random stumps. The surfaces are worked. The spacing is intentional, and to a modern eye, they read as a field of stone penises. That visual impact is part of why they keep showing up in documentaries and articles. They're striking, they're easy to grasp in a single glance, and they invite instant interpretation. Our brains are very good at spotting sexual imagery, and once you see it, it's hard to unsee. But here's where we have to slow down. First, the description, then the meaning. Formally, these stones are upright, rounded monoliths, generally shorter than the towering T-pillars. Many are carved directly from the surrounding bedrock, so they're rooted in the hill itself rather than set into prepared sockets. They cluster in specific spaces rather than being distributed randomly across the site. At least in the excavated areas, they show up in what look like architecturally bounded zones. The sunken chamber with the central face at one end, the carved basin-like features, the tight forest of little pillars. Context matters too. These phallic forms are not sprinkled around domestic hearths or scattered across living floors. They appear in what archaeologists interpret as special use spaces, enclosed, sometimes sunken, sometimes associated with benches, steps, or carefully shaped walls. Spaces that already feel set apart from the routines of daily subsistence. So we can say, carved stone uprights with phallic overtones, clustered in architecturally distinct areas, often integrated into the bedrock. That's the observation. What they meant is the hard part. The most obvious modern reading is that they're about sexuality, fertility, masculinity, maybe power. That reading isn't baseless. Across many later cultures, phallic imagery is tied to ideas of generative force, the ability to create life, to guarantee crops, to protect communities by channeling some kind of raw potency. Early Neolithic sites in other regions sometimes show similar themes. In parts of southeastern Europe and the Levant, we find figurines that emphasize breasts and hips, or occasionally male genitals, in ways that clearly foreground reproductive anatomy. At Çatalhöyük, a few thousand years after Karahan Tepe, bulls' horns and animal bodies are built into walls and platforms in ways that likely carried associations of strength, virility, and abundance. So it's reasonable to think that Neolithic communities had symbolic systems in which bodies, human and animal, stood in for bigger concepts, reproduction, continuity, protection, social roles. But reasonable is not the same as proven. Those stone shafts at Karahan Tepe could have layered meanings. They might encode fertility ideas, yes, but they might also mark status differences, age grades, or mythic episodes we know nothing about. A cluster of pillars might represent not a bunch of penises in the way a modern mind jumps to, but a group of beings, a lineage, or a moment in a story that happened to be expressed with a bodily metaphor. Consider the relationship between the T-pillars and the more overtly phallic ones. If the T's are semi-anthropomorphic, bodies reduced to torso and shoulders outlines, then the carved heads and the carved genitals at the site could be seen as filling in the rest of the figure, but in separated, specialized ways. One space emphasizing faces and gazes, another emphasizing generative organs, another leaving the body as an abstract presence. That fragmentation of the body, Head here, sex there, torso everywhere, could itself be symbolic. Maybe different architectural zones corresponded to different aspects of personhood, identity, reproduction, social ties, protective power. The whole person was never shown all at once, but distributed through the architecture. Again, that's an interpretive model, not a settled fact. What anchors it is the pattern. Bodily forms repeat. They're not accidental, and they show up right at the beginning of large-scale stone architecture in this region. Why would explicit body symbolism appear so early? One possibility is that when communities start investing huge effort into a specific place, hauling stone, carving bedrock, organizing work crews, they also need ways to make that place feel socially and cosmologically loaded. You don't just build a big empty chamber, you populate it with meanings. The easiest way to do that for a human mind is to lean on the most familiar reference point you have, the body you live in. Your own form becomes the template for thinking about the world. Up, down, front, back, center, periphery. All of these spatial ideas can be mapped onto bodies. So can ideas of inside and outside, hidden and revealed, pure and polluted. Genitals in many societies sit right at the crossroads of those oppositions. Powerful but vulnerable, necessary for continuity but often wrapped in rules and taboos. That brings in another angle we can't rule out: humour and taboo. It's easy to imagine these stones only in solemn terms, as if every ritual was heavy and grave. But in many documented traditional societies, ceremonies that deal with sex, fertility, or initiation are shot through with laughter, teasing, and deliberate shock. Jokes and embarrassment can be tools for teaching and bonding. Carved phallic stones in a restricted chamber could have been part of rites that mixed awe with awkwardness, testing the reactions of initiates, marking transitions from childhood to adulthood. Do we know that happened at Karahan Tepe? No. But when we see explicit sexual imagery in other early Neolithic contexts, it is often bound up with controlled access, performance, and social learning, not just with abstract fertility cults. The architecture at Karahan, sunken spaces, limited entrances, built-in focal points, could easily support that kind of use. A different but related theme is protection. In some later Near Eastern traditions, exaggerated genitals or sexual scenes appear as apotropaic symbols, meant to ward off harm, not invite it. The logic is that raw, uncontrolled life force can scare away or overpower dangerous forces. It's possible that the builders of Karahan Tepe saw generative organs not just as symbols of making life, but as shields against what threatened life. Disease, drought, misfortune. Here the context of the early Holocene matters again. These communities were living through major environmental shifts. Water regimes were changing. Game distributions were in flux, rooting powerful symbols directly into the bedrock. Quite literally carving potency into the bones of the hill could have been a way of stabilizing a world that felt unstable. Through all of this, it's important to come back to what archaeologists can say with some confidence, and where the boundary lies. We can map where the phallic pillars occur, how they relate to other features, what their sizes and orientations are. We can compare them to similar motifs at Göbekli Tepe and across the wider Taş Tepeler landscape, where overt male anatomy is less common but not absent. We can note that body parts, heads, arms, hands, sometimes genitals, are recurring elements in this regional symbolic toolkit. We can also say that the combination of standardized pillar forms, carved human heads, and explicit sexual imagery suggests a coherent, embodied way of thinking about ritual space. These monuments were not neutral markers. They were someone, or something, to the people who built them. They organized not just movement, but meaning. Beyond that, we're in the realm of carefully framed possibilities. Fertility, masculinity, power, protection, regeneration, social roles, humor, taboo, initiation, all alive hypotheses, some more strongly grounded than others, all needing more data, more context, and more comparative work. What we shouldn't do is collapse those possibilities into neat, single-line explanations. It's a fertility cult. It's a temple of masculinity. Those sound satisfying, but they flatten what was likely a dense web of associations. The safest position is also the most interesting one. These people were using their own bodies as a primary language for thinking about the world, and they were willing to carve that language into stone at a monumental scale. The details of the grammar are lost, but the basic fact of embodiment is written everywhere, and that embodied symbolism doesn't float in the abstract. It's anchored in specific built spaces, enclosures with benches, thresholds, and carefully orchestrated movement. To understand how those phallic pillars and T-shaped bodies actually functioned in practice, we have to look not just at the stones themselves, but at the rooms they're in, the paths that lead to them, and the ways people may have gathered, sat, watched, and participated around them. If you strip away the symbolic readings for a moment and just pay attention to the shapes of the spaces, another pattern comes into focus. Karahan Tepe is full of places designed for people to be together. Not in the loose, open way that a campsite or a hunting ground brings people together, but in highly structured, almost choreographed ways. You don't just show up and mill around. The architecture tells you where you can stand, where you can't, where your attention is supposed to go. Take the sunken enclosures. These are not random pits. They're cut down into the bedrock with steep walls, clear entrances, and internal features that organize how bodies move and where they rest. Around the inner edges, you often find continuous ledges or stepped benches carved right out of the stone. They're at a human-friendly height. You could sit on them. You could line people up along them. You could create a ring of bodies wrapped around whatever is in the middle. In the pillar pool area, that whatever is a cluster of short phallic uprights. In other enclosures, it's a pair of taller T-pillars, a carved head, a basin, a focal stone. In every case, the logic is similar. A circumscribed interior, seating or standing places around the perimeter, and a strongly marked centre or focal end. That's an architecture of gathering. It suggests scenes like this. People descending a narrow entrance, stepping down into a cooler, darker hollow. Some move along the bench and sit. Others stand behind them. Attention naturally settles on the central pillars, or on the carved face at the far wall, or on whoever is allowed to stand in that inner zone and do something. The stones don't just exist, they stage an event. You can see the same principle at Göbekli Tepe. Circular or oval enclosures with T-pillars in the middle, shorter elements around the edge, and often a kind of inner no-go area defined by the layout. Karahan Tepe shares that basic grammar, but with its own twists. More work sunk into the living rock, more explicit sculptural elements carved from the floor itself. The repetition matters. When a particular form of space keeps showing up across a site and across related sites in a region, it's not just an aesthetic preference. It's a solution to a recurring social problem. How do you bring a group of people together in a way that makes their roles clear? How do you control who gets to speak, who gets to act, and who has to sit and watch? Architecture is one answer. A bench set against the wall is not neutral. A raised step, a narrowed entrance, a sunken floor. Each of these shapes behavior. If you carve a continuous bench, you've created a ring of equals, or at least the appearance of one. If you leave a gap in that bench at a particular point, and emphasize a central pillar nearby, you've created a privileged axis of approach. Someone can stand there and be framed by stone, literally set apart. Archaeologists often use neutral words like enclosure or special building for these spaces. They don't want to smuggle in assumptions. But if you imagine them as theatres of a sort, places where performance happens and audiences form, they become easier to think about. Performance here doesn't have to mean elaborate drama. It can be as simple as storytelling, as formal as a seasonal rite, as intense as initiation or conflict mediation. A person or small group stands or moves within the inner zone. Others sit along the benches, watching, responding, maybe chanting or participating at scripted moments. The architecture creates lines of sight. It funnels sound. It defines who is in and who is out, even within the same hollow. This is where the term ritual starts to both help and get in the way. Ritual is a broad, convenient label. It tells us that the activities in these spaces were probably not everyday tasks like napping tools or butchering game. The effort invested, the recurring layouts, the symbolic carvings, all point toward actions that were special, repeated, and meaningful in more than a practical sense. But if we just say ritual building and stop there, we flatten the possibilities. What we can infer are some basic types of activity. People sat, people stood, people needed to see a focal point. People likely came and went in groups, not one by one. The presence of benches and raised or centrally positioned stones suggests roles, performers and observers, leaders and followers, initiates and elders, or perhaps representatives of different lineages facing one another across a shared centre. From ethnographic parallels in many small-scale societies, we know that such spaces are often used for a bundle of functions: settling disputes, making collective decisions, receiving visitors, marking life cycle transitions, conducting offerings to unseen beings, retelling origin stories. The same ritual house might host all of these at different times of year. Nothing at Karahan Tepe compels a single interpretation, but the combination of communal seating, restricted access, and dominant central symbols is exactly what you'd expect if these were multi-purpose gathering houses rather than temples in the later single-god sense. But raises a bigger question. Were these places in the middle of where people lived, or set apart as destinations? Here the evidence is still unfolding. So far, Karahan Tepe doesn't show extensive domestic architecture, rows of houses, thick layers of everyday trash, the way later Neolithic villages do. Instead, we see clusters of special buildings, bedrock-cut spaces, and monumental stones. That has led many researchers to lean toward the episodic gathering place model, people living in smaller camps across the landscape, coming here seasonally for big events. Göbekli Tepe has often been described in similar terms. No clear houses, lots of enclosures, lots of feasting debris. A place you go to, not a place you wake up in every day. But that dichotomy, ritual centre versus settlement, might be too sharp. A site can be both more and less than a permanent village. People might have stayed here for weeks or months during certain seasons, then dispersed. Small groups might have used particular enclosures more often, while the full community assembled only rarely. There could have been lightweight shelters, now erased, around the more durable stone cores. Whatever the pattern, the architecture suggests that when people were here, being together in structured ways was the point. Which brings us back to the social problems monuments might be trying to solve. Anytime you have multiple bands or families coming together, you get opportunities and tensions. You want to exchange mates, share information, and build alliances. You also risk jealousy, conflict over resources, disputes about past wrongs. A big labour-intensive, symbol-rich enclosure offers a kind of neutral stage for working those issues out. It anchors group identity. We are the people who built this. It channels pride away from individual boasting and into shared achievement. It provides a physically impressive reminder of collective obligations, debts, and histories. At the same time, the internal layout gives you tools for managing status and conflict. Elders on one side, younger people on another. Leaders near the focal pillar, rival factions facing one another across it. Agreements made, oaths sworn, stories told about times when the ancestors, whose presence is suggested by those carved heads and bodily symbols, dealt with similar problems. Ritual, in this sense, isn't a separate sphere from politics or economics. It's the medium through which those things are stabilized. You don't just decide to cooperate, you enact cooperation in a shared space, following familiar sequences of action, under the gaze of stone witnesses and living peers. Seen this way, the benches and enclosures at Karahan Tepe are not just odd early experiments in monumentality. They are tools for making fragile, newly expanded human communities hold together. The small hunter-gatherer and early herding groups in this region began to aggregate more frequently, to share feasts, to coordinate access to water and game. They needed more than just good intentions. They needed places that could reliably turn gatherings into communities. Karahan Tepe's architecture is one answer to that need. Cut into the bedrock, shaped for sitting and watching, oriented around powerful focal stones, these enclosures are like fossilized social technologies. They show us that long before cities, councils, or written laws, people were already using space, stone, and shared attention as tools to organize themselves. And that organization didn't come free. It required planning, coordination, and enormous labor. Costs that only make sense if the gatherings here were doing serious work for the societies that built them. If the gatherings at Karahan Tepe were doing serious social work, that immediately raises another question. Who did the actual work in stone? Because none of this happens by accident. A carved bench you can sit on, a pool sunk into bedrock, a pillar tuned to the proportions of a human body. Those are the endpoints of a long chain of effort. First you have to find the stone. In this part of southeastern Turkey, that's mostly limestone. It weathers into blocks and layers. But to get a pillar or carved head, you can't just pick up whatever's lying around. You have to identify seams with the right thickness and integrity. That means people walking the landscape, knowing which outcrops fracture cleanly, which layers are too crumbly, which veins carry hidden faults that will split halfway through carving. Then you have to detach the pieces. At Göbekli Tepe we can see extraction scars, pillars that were outlined and then abandoned. Karahan Tepe shows similar traces. Someone has to mark the block on the bedrock, score channels along its sides, and undercut the base with stone picks and hammerstones. It's loud, repetitive, time-consuming work. You're not doing this between hunting trips as a casual hobby. You're committing days and weeks. After that comes shaping. A T-pillar doesn't just emerge from the quarry. Each edge has to be dressed, each face flattened, the characteristic crossbar defined. Human heads carved from the same bedrock as the floor require even more finesse. Blocking out the mass, then gradually refining the cheeks, the nose, the brow. At Karahan Tepe, some of these faces are remarkably smooth and consistent. That implies a practiced hand, not a one-off experiment. And then there's hauling. Even when the stone is local, moving a multi-ton block from a quarry face to an enclosure takes planning. You need routes cleared of big obstacles. You need sledges or rollers or simple skids, ropes twisted from plant fibers or animal hides, and enough people to apply force in the right direction. You need someone to coordinate the pull so you don't tip the pillar, snap the ropes, or crush someone's leg. Finally, erection. Raising a heavy stone and slotting it neatly into a prepared socket is an engineering problem. You have to dig the hole, line it, tilt the pillar in, pack stones and fill around the base so it doesn't lean or wobble. Maybe you build an earthen ramp and drag the pillar up, then lever it upright with progressively stacked supports. None of this requires a formal blueprint, but it does require a sequence of steps held in someone's head and communicated to others. And once the stones are up, they don't just sit there forever. Surfaces weather. Plaster or pigment, if used, flakes. Floors accumulate debris. At Göbekli Tepe, some enclosures show resurfacing and repair. At Karahan Tepe, the clean cuts and sharp edges of certain features suggest episodes of recutting or refurbishing. That implies a maintenance schedule of sorts. People return, they clean, patch, straighten, touch up carvings. They keep the place in working order. Taken as a whole, this chain, from quarry to carved and standing stone, represents thousands of person-hours. So who is organizing that? There's no sign here of palaces, storage silos, or elite residences. No evidence for a permanent ruling class in the later sense. Yet the coordination is real. Stones don't plan themselves. One way to think about this is to flip the default story. Instead of assuming that kings or chiefs are necessary to make large projects happen, we can start from small, egalitarian groups and ask how they coordinate big pushes of effort without permanent hierarchy. Ethnographic examples give us a few options. You can have councils, elders or respected adults who talk through plans, assign responsibilities, and resolve disputes. Decisions emerge through consensus, not command. Leadership is situational and persuasive rather than enforced by standing armies. You can have specialists who are not elites in the economic sense, but who carry particular authority in certain domains. A master carver whose judgment about stone quality is trusted. A ritual expert who knows the correct sequence for dedicating a pillar. A seasoned organizer who has overseen similar construction before. You can have seasonal leaders. During hunting migrations, one person's skills matter most. During building season, another's do. Authority rises and falls with the task at hand, not with permanent office. Once the stones are up and the ritual cycle completed, everyone goes back to more levelled relations. Karahan Tepe could easily have been managed through this kind of flexible, task-specific hierarchy. No crowns, no tax registers, but a thick web of obligations and reputations. If a lineage failed to turn up for quarrying, everyone noticed. If someone shirked during hauling, stories would follow them home. Which brings us to incentives. Why would people who are already expending energy hunting, gathering, maybe experimenting with herding, take on the extra burden of dragging pillars out of the ground? Part of the answer is probably very simple: feasts. When big communal work is done in small-scale societies, it is often wrapped in consumption. You come to help with construction because there will be meat, grain, drink, maybe rare treats. Hosts slaughter animals they've been fattening. Open stored food showcase their generosity. The work and the feast are two sides of the same event. But feasts do more than fill stomachs. They create prestige. If your family, or your band, or your clan is known for underwriting the labour at Karahan Tepe, providing workers, meat, stone know-how that becomes social capital, people tell stories about your contribution. Your name is attached to parts of the site. Maybe certain benches, enclosures, or carved motifs are associated with particular groups. That prestige comes with obligations. If your ancestors helped raise the first pillars, you are expected to show up to maintain them. If you benefited from past feasts, you're expected to reciprocate in the future. Labour is not free, but neither is status. There's a running account book written in memory rather than on clay. Shared identity is the glue that holds this economy of effort together. When people say we are the ones who gather at this hill, they're not just talking about belief, they're talking about a set of material commitments. We quarry here, we carve this way, we sit on these benches at these times of year. The site itself becomes a ledger of cooperative acts, a physical record of who has invested in the relationship. Within that system, skilled artisans occupy a special niche. Someone has to remember which limestone beds flake cleanly. Someone has to know how to keep a pillar from cracking as the T-shoulders are cut. Someone has to be able to reproduce a particular style of face, body, or animal motif so that new carvings look right to the community. That knowledge isn't purely individual. It has to be passed on. You can imagine apprentices watching older carvers, trying out techniques on smaller stones, gradually entrusted with more visible tasks. Styles would be learned and corrected. No, the shoulders are too narrow. Our pillars don't look like that. Over time, this creates lineages of craft, not just of blood. You might be child of X, and also student of the master who carved that head. Archaeologically, we see hints of this in the consistency of certain forms across multiple enclosures, and across the wider Tashtepalaya region. The same basic T-shape, similar proportions, recurring ways of representing animals and abstract signs. These are not random, they're signatures of an ongoing teaching tradition. Each new episode of building or refurbishment strengthens that tradition, maybe every few years or every few decades. A bench is extended, an enclosure deepened, a new pillar added. Each time the community revisits the techniques, reenacts the social organization needed to mobilize labor, reaffirms who knows what and who owes whom. What began as a big, perhaps unprecedented effort to cut a first enclosure into bedrock becomes, over generations, a pattern. This is how we do things. Children grow up watching adults work here. Later, they become the ones swinging hammerstones. The site becomes layered, not just physically but socially. And that, perhaps, is the deepest logic behind the enormous investment of effort at places like Karahan Tepe and Göbekli Tepe. You're not just making a stage for one event, or even for one generation. You're making a place that can hold the community together across time. Stone is stubborn. Once a pillar is raised, it outlives its makers. Once a face is carved into the wall of a sunken room, it can stare back at people who never knew the person who shaped it. Investing labour in this kind of material anchors stories, obligations, and identities in something more durable than memory alone. When small, mobile groups decide to sink their sweat into bedrock, they are, in a sense, betting on the future. They're saying, others will come after us who will care enough to keep this going. Our descendants, or our allies, or whoever inherits this hill, will see these stones and know they belong to a chain of work and gathering that stretches beyond any one lifetime. Karahan Tepe, with its carved benches, its cut-down chambers, its carefully raised pillars, is one of the earliest places where we can see that bet made visible. It shows us that long before cities and bureaucrats, humans had already discovered a powerful truth. If you want a community to last, you put its agreements into stone, and you keep coming back to renew them. If people are coming back to renew those stone agreements, something has to make the trip worthwhile. You can't eat pillars. You can admire them, you can fear them, you can tell stories about them. But if you're walking days across a rough landscape, maybe bringing children, elderly relatives, dogs, and everything you need for a week or more, there has to be a reward you can feel in your stomach. This is where archaeologists reach for a concept that shows up again and again in small-scale societies. Feasting. Not just we ate dinner together. Not just casual sharing of whatever happened to be in your pouch that day. Feasting is food turned up to 11. It's excess. It's deliberate concentration of calories, labor, and attention into a limited time and place. The basic idea is straightforward. If you want scattered bands to converge on a single hilltop, you make sure that when they arrive, there will be more food and drink there than they normally see in weeks. Meat roasted in quantities that feel almost wasteful. Fat, marrow, liver. High-value parts handed out in public. Seeds pounded into porridge, maybe baked into early breads or flat cakes. Wild fruits dried and rehydrated. If there is anything fermented, anything slightly intoxicating, this is when you bring it out. Do we have a photograph of a feast at Karahan Tepe? Of course not. What we do have in the broader Tash Tepele region are patterns. At Göbekli Tepe, excavations have turned up huge volumes of animal bone, heavily dominated by wild game, especially gazelle, aurochs, wild sheep. Many of those bones are broken in ways consistent with marrow extraction. Some come from very young or very old animals, which you wouldn't necessarily target if you were trying to maximize long-term herd stability. There are also large stone basins, some with residues that may be linked to processing liquids, possibly brewing. Karahan Tepe is less fully excavated, and its faunal record is still being built up. Early reports talk about animal remains, but the statistics aren't yet as detailed or widely published as Göbekli's. So when we talk about large-scale feasting at Karahan Tepe specifically, we're partly leaning on analogy, sites of similar age, with similar architecture, in the same cultural orbit, that do show feasting signatures. If future seasons of excavation at Karahan Tepe uncover massive deposits of animal bone concentrated in certain areas, with cut marks, burning patterns, and breakage consistent with intensive butchery and cooking, that will strengthen the feasting case. So will evidence of specialized processing areas, grinding stones clustered together, hearths large enough to cook for crowds rather than for one family, dumps of ash and charred bone that suggest repeated big events rather than everyday meals. Even now, the architecture nudges us in that direction. Benches around enclosures imply people sitting, maybe listening, maybe watching something happen in the center, but they also imply people sharing time. A feast doesn't have to happen right on the benches. It could be in nearby open areas, but the idea of a socially synchronized event fits the built environment. You carve a room that can hold many bodies, and then you give them a reason to occupy it together. Feasts do several things at once. On the surface, they are obvious. They feed you. After long treks and hard work, that alone matters. Underneath, they knit alliances. If your lineage slaughters 2 extra gazelle for the gathering, everyone sees your generosity. If another group shows up with baskets of nuts they've collected from a distant valley, that contribution is remembered. The flow of food becomes the flow of obligation. You ate our meat last year. When we are in trouble, we expect you to respond. We shared our surplus with you. When we announce a marriage or ask for hunting partners, you take us seriously. In small, mobile societies, you can't store wealth very easily in objects or buildings, but you can store it in relationships. Big, memorable meals are a powerful way to deposit into that account. Feasting also smooths conflict. Hunter-gatherer ethnography from many parts of the world shows people using food-heavy gatherings to resolve tensions that, left alone, might explode into violence. When everyone is together at a ritual site, there is a structured opportunity to air grievances, trade, arrange future visits, and to do all that in a context saturated with shared pleasure. It is harder to storm off in fury when you've just accepted a generous portion of roasted meat in front of the whole community. Marriage networks fit into this too. A place like Karahan Tepe isn't just a stone theatre. It's a human crossroads. Bands that spend most of the year apart can bring their young people together. Scope out potential partners, negotiate exchanges. Food and feasts are often the stage on which these negotiations play out. Who sits with whom? Who shares which dishes? Who is given the choicest cuts? These are social signals as much as culinary decisions. From that perspective, the feasts aren't just byproducts of ritual. They are rituals. Think about the choreography of a big meal. Animals have to be hunted, trapped, or perhaps by this time penned and managed. Plants have to be gathered, maybe weeded or encouraged in particular patches. People have to agree on when to arrive, who gets what, who serves. The act of distributing food can be accompanied by spoken formulas, blessings, toasts, jokes, small performances. Children watch and learn the correct way to behave when a certain animal is presented, when a certain cut is handed over. You don't necessarily need carved figurines or altars to have religious emotion. The warmth of a full belly after a lean season, shared with dozens of others under the looming presence of pillars and carved heads, can itself feel like contact with something larger. Ancestors, spirits, the land. The boundary between practical refueling and sacred ceremony is blurry. Eating together at the right time, in the right place, in the right sequence, may have been one of the primary rituals these sites existed to host. Now layer on another emerging force in this landscape: the early management of plants and animals. By the time Karahan Tepe was active, people in this region were not farmers in the later sense, but they were not pure foragers either. Across Upper Mesopotamia, we see signs of people tending wild stands of cereals, selectively harvesting, maybe resowing, gradually nudging grasses toward domestication. There are hints of early experiments with controlling sheep and goats, corralling or culling rather than simply chasing. Why does that matter for feasts? Because once you can slightly control where food comes from and when it's available, you can plan abundance. If certain families or bands have access to particularly good stands of wild einkorn, or valleys where gazelle reliably pass, they can anticipate surpluses. They can hold back animals or grain with an eye toward a future gathering at the hilltop. Feasts become less about random windfalls and more about scheduled displays of management skill. Look what we can produce. Look what we can spare. This can intensify the whole system. If status accrues to those who put on the best feasts, there is an incentive to invest more in cultivating patches of land, in keeping animals alive longer to fatten them, in coordinating hunts to coincide with the ritual calendar. The gatherings at places like Karahan Tepe might actually drive early cultivation and herd management rather than the other way around. The desire to feed the feast could be a crucible for new economic behaviors. Again, we have to be careful. At Karahan Tepe itself, we don't yet have the same depth of plant remains and animal bones analyzed as we do at some neighboring sites. The details of which species were eaten in what quantities, which seasons saw the most intense activity, are still being worked out. So when we talk about scheduled feasts linked to early cultivation here, we are extrapolating from the wider Tastepele pattern and from what we know of similar societies globally. What is solid is this: a site that demands large, periodic investments of labour in a world of small mobile groups almost certainly relied on the pull of plenty. Food is one of the few things powerful enough to move people over and over again across difficult terrain, to keep them sitting together long enough to talk, argue, marry, reconcile, remember. The stones provide the stage and the symbolism. The feasts provide the fuel. And there's one more ingredient those feasts would have needed, especially in this dry, stony landscape. Water. In a place like Karahan Tepe, water is not background. It's destiny. Look at a modern satellite map of the Şanlıurfa region and you'll see it immediately. This isn't lush forest. It's a semi-arid plateau, punctuated by wadis and seasonal streams, with long, dry summers where anything that isn't carefully stored or deeply rooted simply disappears. In that kind of world, you don't just wander and hope. You learn the rhythm. You pay attention to when the winter rains usually come, when the low spots green up, when temporary pools last longest. You know which springs are reliable through late summer and which ones fail by early autumn. Your movements, your hunting rounds, your plant gathering, your social visits, they all have a seasonal beat laid down by water. Archaeologists working in Upper Mesopotamia talk about resource mosaics rather than one single good spot. You might have rich grazing in one valley right after the rains, but better nut trees on a distant slope in late summer, and cereal stands ripening somewhere else entirely. No single location is perfect year-round, so how do you get scattered groups to converge on one stone hilltop again and again? You synchronize them to the same environmental drum. One strong hypothesis for Karahan Tepe and its sister sites is that gatherings were timed to predictable seasonal peaks, when rains had recently fallen, when nearby hollows still held pools, when animals followed fresh growth along certain routes, when wild cereals or pulses were ready to harvest. We don't yet have a detailed layer-by-layer seasonal activity chart for Karahan Tepe itself that requires fine-grained analysis of animal teeth, plant remains, and growth rings that is still ongoing. But at Göbekli Tepe, there are hints that large events clustered in particular parts of the year, likely connected to gazelle migrations, which are themselves linked to rainfall and pasture cycles. If that pattern holds across the Taştepeler sites, you can imagine something like this. As winter rains soften the land, grasses and herbs pop up in the depressions and along the shallow valleys. Herds of gazelle move to take advantage. So do human groups, following the same seasonal bounty. Certain low passes and ridges become predictable highways, not paved but nonetheless well known. You go this way in this month because your grandparents did, and their grandparents before them. Ridgetop sites like Karahan Tepe sit exactly where those invisible highways converge. From a distance, the plateau rises gently. Up close, it's a network of shallow basins and limestone outcrops. A prominent spur with carved pillars isn't just a random choice. It's a landmark pinned to the routes people already use. When you crest that rise, you not only see others approaching from different valleys, you can also look down and read the state of the land. How green the hollows are, how full the temporary ponds look, where game might be concentrating. Even if the site doesn't sit on a big permanent spring, it doesn't have to. In a seasonal world, good enough for a few weeks can be plenty. Archaeologists have been looking more carefully in recent years for water management features at early sites. Carved basins fed by runoff, plaster-lined pits that might have held stored water, channels cut into bedrock. At some Neolithic villages in the broader region, there are clear cisterns and wells. At Karahan Tepe, the picture is still emerging. There are bedrock depressions, hollows, and possible basins that might have collected rainwater, but their exact functions are still debated. So we have to be honest. Nobody can yet point to a neat row of obvious stone cisterns and say, this is how they watered the crowds. What we can say is that these people were perfectly capable of reading and manipulating water on the landscape. They were shaping stone on a massive scale. They understood slopes and gravity well enough to lay out terraces and enclosures. It would be surprising if they hadn't also noticed that carving a shallow basin in the right place could stretch the usefulness of a rain event by days or weeks. Even a small improvement matters. A natural depression deepened into a bowl could hold enough water for a short gathering. A crack in the rock widened into a gutter could feed a storage pit. We may eventually find plaster traces or micro-erosion patterns that make these systems clearer. For now, water management at Karahan Tepe sits in the realm of plausible interpretation. supported more by regional analogy and common sense than by direct smoking gun features. But seasonality isn't just about where you drink. It's about when you build. Imagine you're part of a small band that uses Karahan Tepe as a ritual and meeting place. The year isn't a blank sheet. It's divided into periods when you are scrambling to survive, and periods when you have just enough surplus time and energy to do something extra. You probably don't carve a multi-ton pillar in the middle of the leanest month when you're worrying about where the next meal is coming from. You do that work when food is relatively abundant and predictable, right after a good hunting season, or in the wake of a successful plant harvest, when bellies are full and you can afford to spend daylight on something that doesn't immediately feed you. In that sense, the building phases at Karahan Tepe are themselves fossilized seasons. Each enclosure, each new set of benches, each carefully cut head lowered into place represents not just abstract piety, but a specific window in the annual cycle when labor was available. Over decades, those windows stack up into architecture. Maintenance fits the rhythm too. Plaster surfaces crack, pillars tilt, benches crumble. You don't fix them every day. You patch and replaster when people are back, when the gatherings happen, when the rains have made it possible to camp nearby, hunt nearby, maybe water animals in the area. The monuments are not static backdrops. They are synchronized with the same pulse that moves herds and ripens seeds. All of this starts to answer the question that hovers over Karahan Tepe. Why this exact patch of rock and not the valley floor or the next hill over? Part of the answer is ecological. This spot sits inside a web of roots that made it accessible from multiple directions. It likely lay close enough to seasonal water and grazing to support short, intense occupations without exhausting local resources. Its bedrock offered solid footing for heavy stones and natural contours that could be carved into rooms and basins. It was high enough to see and be seen, but not so remote as to be impractical. But part of the answer is not something you can measure in liters or calories. Once a place becomes the stage for important gatherings, for first alliances, major feasts, difficult negotiations, marriages, funerals, it accumulates meaning. The first generation may have chosen it for very pragmatic reasons. Good access, decent water, nice vantage point. The fifth generation returns because this is where we meet. This is where our ancestors carved the first pillars. This is where the great feast happened in the year of the long rain. Ecology gives you the options. Memory and symbolism narrow them down to one hill. By the time the stone heads are staring from their carved pits and the T-shaped pillars are rising around them, Karahan Tepe is no longer just a smart place to be when the rains come. It is a node where climate, movement and story intersect. The timing of the visits follows the sky and the soil. The choice of the spot follows something harder to pin down. A shared decision that this, among all the possible ridges, is where the human and more than human worlds will meet. And in that meeting, one theme keeps surfacing in the archaeology. The presence of the dead. If you zoom out from Karahan Tepe and look across the wider pre-pottery Neolithic world, you start to see a pattern that's hard to ignore. People were doing strange, careful, deliberate things with the bodies of their dead. At Jericho, several hundred kilometers to the southwest, and a bit later in time, archaeologists found skulls that had been removed from skeletons, the faces rebuilt in plaster, the eye sockets filled with shells. At Chiunu and other early sites in southeastern Anatolia, there are buildings with human remains under the floors, sometimes disturbed and rearranged, long bones missing, skulls separated, burials reopened months or years after death. This isn't casual disposal. It looks like a world where the dead don't simply go away. They are revisited, moved, curated. Pieces of them, especially heads, are treated almost like powerful objects. It's dangerous to assume that every PPN community thought about death in the same way, or that practices we see in one place must have existed everywhere. But when skull retrieval, secondary burial, and close physical proximity to the dead keep turning up from the Levant to Upper Mesopotamia, it suggests a broad shared idea. Ancestors matter, and their presence needs managing. Karahan Tepe fits into this horizon, but in its own quiet way. So far, there is no big cemetery exposed on the hilltop. No row of graves wrapping the enclosures. Human remains from the site are still sparse and scattered in the published record. That means we have to tread carefully. We can't point to a chamber full of skulls and say, "Here is the ancestor house." What we do have instead are carved heads, human faces emerging from stone, isolated, repeated, often emphasized in places that seem to matter architecturally, set into walls, aligned with enclosures, clustered in specific spaces. In a region where we know people were separating and venerating actual human skulls, the appearance of durable, carved stone heads is at least suggestive. Not proof, not a one-to-one replacement, but suggestive. They might be gods, spirits, mythic beings. They might be stylized portraits of living leaders, or generalized images of personhood, or they might sit somewhere between all of those, stone stand-ins for an important category of beings that includes dead kin, remembered founders, perhaps even non-human forces that are spoken of as if they were elders. When you live in a small community, your social world is shallow in time. You know your parents, grandparents, maybe a few generations back through stories. But when you gather from many bands and lineages, a sites like Karahan Tepe seem designed to facilitate, you suddenly have a deeper past to negotiate. Whose ancestors count? Who has rights to speak, to host, to decide what happens in the enclosure? One way to make that past visible is to bring actual bones and skulls. Another is to carve heads into the very architecture. If you think of the T-shaped pillars as powerful presences, maybe human-like, maybe other than human, the carved heads could be their more intimate cousins, not towering abstract forms, but highly focused faces. This line, this clan, this remembered person. Again, we're in interpretive territory here. We don't have inscriptions. We don't have an oral history from 11,000 years ago explaining who these faces are. What we do have is a consistent anthropological reality. In societies without writing, the dead are often the backbone of social memory. They are how you tell time. When your grandfather died. When the woman with the scar on her arm was taken by the leopard. They anchor land claims, marriage rights, obligations. A piece of ground is not just where you camp. It's where so-and-so is buried. It's where their spirit listens. In that kind of world, a monumental site like Karahan Tepe isn't just a meeting place in space. It's a meeting place in time. You don't need written records to remember. You need landmarks, rituals, and repetition. The enclosures, benches, and carved bodies become what cognitive scientists call external memory devices. You store pieces of information outside the brain so that stories have something to hook onto. Imagine being a child brought to Karahan Tepe for the first time. An elder points to a particular head, half emerging from the wall, and tells you, "This is the place of our beginning," or "This is the one who first cut the stone here." The head is not literally that person, but it gives the story a fixed address. Next time you come back, the stone hasn't moved. The narrative can be reattached, retold, adjusted, but always anchored to that same carved presence. Over decades, maybe centuries, a whole lattice of stories could accrete around these stones. Who built which enclosure, who sponsored which feast, which group did what in the year of the drought or the flood. The pillars and heads don't record history the way a clay tablet does, but they scaffold memory, stabilizing key episodes so they can be transmitted across generations. This is one way to keep the past close without archives, dates, or written genealogies. You walk through your history. You sit on its benches. You touch its pillars. You look into the faces your grandparents looked at. Does this mean Karahan Tepe was primarily an ancestor shrine? We don't know. The evidence so far doesn't show rows of burials under every floor, or piles of bones tucked neatly along the walls. If excavators start uncovering repeated burials beneath thresholds, clusters of skulls near specific heads, or cut marks consistent with defleshing and secondary burial, then the case for a strong mortuary function will grow. So would signs of repeated burning and rebuilding of floors with human remains incorporated, patterns seen at some other Neolithic ritual buildings. Right now, our sense of death at Karahan Tepe leans heavily on analogy. We look at Göbekli Tepe. where human bones with cut marks have been found in ritual contexts, hinting at complex treatment of bodies. We look at Jerf el-Hamar, Cheyonu, and other early sites where special buildings hold human remains and at times appear to be deliberately decommissioned or burned. We see that in this cultural world, the boundary between house, shrine, gathering hall and tomb can be surprisingly thin. Then we come back to Karahan Tepe and its stone heads, its enclosed spaces, its careful staging of human-like forms emerging from rock and floor, and we say, this would be a very natural place to weave the living and the dead together. Not just through bones, but through story. Maybe actual burials clustered on the slopes, beyond the currently exposed areas, with the hilltop serving as the place where those burials were collectively remembered and activated. Maybe the dead were brought here temporarily, during decomposition, or for ritual processing, and then carried back to smaller camp cemeteries. The possibilities are many, and the data, for now, are thin. So we have to sit with that uncertainty. What we can say, without overreaching, is that Karahan Tepe belongs to a wider Neolithic constellation in which the dead are not absent. They are part of how communities define themselves, claim continuity, and make sense of change. The architecture we see, the heads, the pillars, the enclosing walls, provides the perfect stage for that work of remembrance. And that, in turn, feeds into something bigger than any single ancestor, feast, or burial. Because when you start building places that hold memory in stone, you're not just recalling the past, you're inventing a new kind of future. For most of the last century, the story went like this. First, people domesticated plants and animals. Farming made food more predictable. Predictable food let groups settle down, build permanent houses, store grain, raise larger families. Once villages existed and surpluses piled up, then you got extra time and resources for specialists, priests, and big communal projects. Agriculture first. Temples, monuments, and complex rituals later. Karahan Tepe, Göbekli Tepe, and their sister sites don't sit comfortably inside that script. These hilltops are old. We're talking 11th millennium BCE territory, well before clear, full-blown agriculture in this region. No fields of neatly domesticated wheat ringing the site. No rows of house foundations full of grinding tools and storage bins that scream farm village on the scale we see 1,000 years later. Yet right here, on a bare rocky ridge, someone orchestrated serious construction. Deep, carved-out enclosures, tall T-pillars, carefully cut benches, those stone heads and bodies. Long-term planning baked into the layout. A labour budget that is hard to reconcile with tiny, scattered bands improvising their way through each season. This is where the old narrative starts to wobble. Archaeologists sometimes talk about monumentality as something that belongs to the agricultural world. You domesticate cereals, you get surpluses. Big groups gather, and eventually you start aligning stones with solstices. But the Tash Tepeler sites suggest another possibility. That at least in this region and in this slice of time, big ritual spaces may have come first, or, more cautiously, that they were developing in tight lockstep with the earliest moves toward cultivation, not after, alongside, entangled. That doesn't mean foragers suddenly woke up one day and invented cathedrals out of nowhere. The people climbing this ridge almost certainly had complex social lives, rich traditions, and deep symbol systems going back many thousands of years. They were already very good at coordinating hunts, sharing food, and remembering obligations. What's new here is the scale and fixity of the place where that social world takes physical form. Instead of rituals carried in bodies, firesides, and portable objects alone, you get rituals anchored in heavy architecture, stone that stays put year after year. To build something like that, you need more than a whim. You need people to agree to show up. To haul stone, to carve, to share tasks, food and time. That, in turn, means you need some confidence that when you call, others will answer, that they will be alive, available, and willing. One way to increase that confidence is to tame parts of the landscape itself. Plant a little more wild grain in promising patches. Encourage certain stands of pistachio or almond. Learn when to expect gazelle herds on nearby steppe. Maybe start keeping a few animals closer, a little longer, hedging your bets against a bad hunt. Karahan Tepe and its neighbours slot neatly into this kind of model. Not pure foragers, not yet full-time farmers. Something in between. People experimenting with cultivation and herding in a world already threaded together by ritual gatherings at prominent hills. From this angle, monument building doesn't look like a byproduct of agriculture. It looks like one of the engines pushing people toward it. Think about the feedback loop. If you have a place like Karahan Tepe that many groups are invested in, there's a strong incentive to make sure your next gathering is well supplied. You want to host a feast that impresses allies, honours ancestors, perhaps marks seasonal transitions correctly. That might mean intensifying food production in the months before a big event, tending stands of wild einkorn, driving game toward particular valleys, storing nuts and dried meat. Over time, the more you rely on these gatherings, the more it pays to have reliable surpluses. And the more you depend on surpluses, the more attractive small experiments in cultivation and herd management become. On the flip side, once you have a little extra food, large gatherings become easier to stage more often, with more people and more ambitious construction. Surplus encourages ritual. Ritual encourages surplus. That's the loop some archaeologists see humming quietly in the background of Karahan Tepe's stones. It's important not to flip the old story on its head too fast. We don't suddenly have a neat, reversed slogan, first temples, then fields. The evidence isn't that simple. At the moment, what we see across the early Holocene Near East is messy and patchy. In some regions, like the southern Levant, plant management and proto-farming seem to take shape early, with modest ritual architecture woven through emerging villages. In Upper Mesopotamia, at places like Göbekli Tepe, Karahan Tepe, Sefer Tepe, and others, the most visually striking early evidence is these ritual enclosures, while clear signs of fully domestic cereals and classic village life show up a bit later. Different valleys, different sequences, different emphasis. No single master timeline. That's why archaeologists talk in terms of multiple pathways to domestication and diverse Neolithic trajectories. Instead of one road from foraging to farming to cities, there are many parallel tracks, sometimes crossing, sometimes diverging. Karahan Tepe belongs to a track where monumentality and gathering may have been a decisive early move. In this story, social and symbolic complexity are not late luxuries. They are fundamental drivers. You start staging periodic, large-scale rituals in fixed places. Those rituals demand coordination, predictability, and stored energy. Slowly, that pressure reshapes how people relate to plants, animals, and each other. But it's still a model, a way of knitting together different strands of data: radiocarbon dates, plant remains, animal bones, architecture, tool types, into a coherent picture. New finds can and do complicate it. If, for example, future excavations around Karahan Tepe uncover clear, early evidence for heavy cultivation, densities of grinding stones, storage pits lined and replastered, plant remains with strong domestication traits that might shift the balance toward a more conventional village plus shrine interpretation. If instead we find even stronger indications of seasonal use, with wild resources dominating the diet and little sign of long-term residential occupation, the ritual hub drawing in mobile groups model will look more secure. Right now, both scenarios have some support. Neither is fully locked in. What we can say, with some confidence, is that Karahan Tepe sits inside a wider wave of change rolling across Southwest Asia after the end of the Younger Dryas. Temperatures are stabilizing. Plant communities are rearranging. Animal ranges are shifting. Human populations are nudging upward. Networks of exchange seem to be thickening, moving obsidian, ideas, and perhaps marriage partners across long distances. In that changing world, certain places start to crystallize as nodal points, high, visible ridges, springs and seeps in otherwise dry country, crossroads between ecological zones. Karahan Tepe is one of those nodes. It anchors people in space and, as we've seen, in time. And once you have such anchors, the ground around them begins to feel different. Hearths multiply, paths get worn, Small habitations appear, perhaps intermittently at first, then for longer stretches. Plots of ground near the hilltop are visited, revisited, and gradually reshaped by human attention. Wild plants that do well with disturbance gain an edge. You can almost see the long arc of civilization beginning to bend into view, not as a sudden invention, but as an emergent property of many small decisions. Where to meet, how to remember, what to plant, who to feed, which stones to raise. Karahan Tepe doesn't give us a clean, definitive origin story. It offers something more interesting. A snapshot from the middle of the transition, when the categories we like to use, hunter, farmer, temple, village, don't separate neatly yet. The carved heads, the T-pillars, the benches and basins, the careful choreography of space, all speak of people already thinking at scales larger than the family, longer than a season. People using stone to stabilize relationships, obligations and stories in a world where everything else, climate, herds, harvests, was still in flux. Civilization, in this light, isn't just about the first city walls or the first written law code. It's about the earlier decision to keep coming back to the same place again and again, and to make that place worthy of return. And that brings us toward another hill, not so far away, where this same impulse takes a slightly different shape. Göbekli Tepe, and the wider Taş Tepeler world that ties these early experiments together. If you walk the map instead of the timeline, one of the first surprises is how close these places really are. Karahan Tepe and Göbekli Tepe sit in the same broader upland zone of southeastern Turkey, on ridges that look out over steppe and lowland. They're not neighbours in a village sense, you're not strolling between them after dinner, but they're comfortably within the kind of distance mobile groups could cover seasonally. Same region, same rough time window. Some of the same big ideas in stone. And yet, when you stand in the plans archaeologists have drawn, they feel like different dialects of a shared architectural language. Göbekli Tepe is the one that first jolted the field awake. Circular and oval enclosures, some over 10 meters across. Pairs of towering T-shaped pillars in the center, ringed by smaller T-pillars set into low stone walls. Rich carvings of animals wrapping around those pillars. Foxes, snakes, boars, birds, wild cattle, sliding over each other in dense, almost overwhelming compositions. It's a place where the animal world is shouting from the stone. Karahan Tepe, in contrast, so far looks more introspective. Yes, it has T-pillars. Yes, there are carved animals here too, and shared themes across the region, snakes, for example, and certain abstract symbols. But Karahan's most arresting features are different. The human, or at least humanoid presence is turned up. You have that extraordinary row of carved heads emerging from a bedrock wall, partially three-dimensional, partially trapped, like ancestors half risen from the stone. You have sculpted bodies and phallic forms integrated into the architecture. You have that deep, bottle-shaped pool or chamber with a standing pillar in the middle that reads, to many as intensely embodied space. The emphasis shifts from animals in motion, encircling the viewer, to human-like forms and anatomies embedded in the structure itself. Part of this difference may be bias in what we're allowed to see. Göbekli Tepe has been under excavation and conservation far longer. More of its enclosures are exposed. We have a better sense of its layout at different phases. Some earlier, more monumental rounds. Later, smaller, perhaps more domesticated structures. A long sequence of building, modification and deliberate burial. Karahan Tepe is catching up, but much of it is still underground. We're looking at a partially excavated complex and trying to infer the whole story from a few open windows. It's entirely possible that more zoomorphic imagery, or more Göbekli-like arrangements, are still waiting in the unexcavated areas. It's also possible that what we see now, this heavy stress on human heads, bodies and phallic symbolism, is a real local signature. So when we compare them, it's worth keeping two different kinds of unknowns in mind. One is simply we haven't dug there yet. The other is deeper. Even once fully exposed, they may never line up as two copies of the same plan. They may represent different roles within a shared world. That's where the idea of Taş Tepeler, the stone hills, comes in. Over the last couple of decades, survey and excavation in this region have turned up a growing cluster of sites with overlapping traits. T-shaped pillars, carved imagery, carefully shaped enclosures, evidence for gathering and ritual activity in the pre-pottery Neolithic. Places like Sefer Tepe, Seibert, Tashla Tepe, Harbet Suvan Tepesi, and others. Some are only lightly explored. Some have yielded small but telling fragments, a pillar here, a carved slab there, that echo the big hills. It's no longer just Göbekli as a lonely anomaly, or Karahan as one curious cousin. It's a landscape dotted with related nodes. In that light, it becomes easier to think in terms of a cultural horizon, a set of shared ideas and practices spread across multiple communities, each hilltop interpreting the common repertoire in its own way. Same toolkit of motifs and building skills, different emphases, different layouts, different roles. Maybe Göbekli Tepe, with its dense animal imagery and giant central pillars, was a major regional gathering point, tuned to large multi-group events. Maybe Karahan Tepe, with its more intimate carved heads and those deeply cut spaces, played more with themes of embodiment, initiation, or ancestor presence. Those are hypotheses, not settled facts. But the network model encourages this kind of differentiated thinking. Instead of asking, what was Göbekli Tepe for? As if one site must somehow solve all our questions about early monumentality, we can ask, what roles did these various hills play within a wider social and ritual web? Once you start imagining that web, certain things fall into place without needing a single dramatic mystery key. If you have multiple prominent hills all built up over generations, it's not hard to picture circuits of movement between them. Groups might climb different sites at different times of year, or for different kinds of events. Feasts, negotiations, rites of passage, ancestor commemorations. Some hills could have been more local. Others might have drawn people from much farther away, functioning as regional pilgrimage centers long before organized religion in the later sense. Shared builders are one possibility. Specialized teams moving between hills, carrying techniques, stories, and stylistic quirks. Shared ideas are almost certain. Similar pillar forms, repeated animal types, common abstract symbols. These suggest some level of communication and mutual awareness, even if each site had its own house style. But similarity doesn't automatically mean that one hill is the blueprint and all others are knockoffs. Cultures can converge on similar forms because they share environments, resources, and problems to solve. They can also spread ideas horizontally, through marriage, trade, and shared rituals, without anyone being in charge or any single master temple dictating the design. This is where a network perspective helps rein in our tendency to look for singular origins. If you assume there must have been one first, one most important site, one original revelation that everyone else copied, then every new discovery becomes a piece to wedge into that hierarchy. If instead you think in terms of interacting communities, co-evolving practices and feedbacks across a region, the puzzle looks different. Karahan Tepe doesn't need Göbekli Tepe to explain it. Göbekli doesn't need to be the spiritual capital whose influence trickles outward in a neat gradient. Both can be nodes in a mesh, sometimes cooperating, sometimes competing, sometimes diverging in how they materialize shared myths or social arrangements. The Tash Tepeler label is useful here, but it's also a shorthand. It doesn't mean every stone hill in the region belongs to exactly the same group, or that there was a single Tash Tepeler people with a unified identity. It just marks a cluster of sites that in this slice of time share certain architectural and symbolic logics. Within that cluster, there were almost certainly fine-grained differences. Language variants, local lineages, slightly different hunting territories and plant niches, distinct stories about origin and obligation tied to particular hills or springs. So when we line up Göbekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe side by side, the goal isn't to crown one as the template and the other as the copy. It's to see how each one makes more sense when you remember it was never alone. A row of stone heads half emerging from bedrock feels different if you imagine it as part of a region where other communities are carving foxes and cranes into towering slabs a day's walk away. A T-shaped pillar at Karahan Tepe is easier to understand when you know there are dozens of T-pillars at neighbouring sites, some rough, some exquisitely finished, suggesting not an isolated invention but a shared, evolving convention. At the same time, responsible comparison means keeping our boundaries clear. Common forms and dates tell us these hills belong to a related world. They don't, by themselves, tell us exactly who was building where, or whether the same named groups used both hilltops, or whether myths carved at one site were told in identical ways at another. We can talk about likely networks, overlapping traditions, and regional horizons. We should be cautious about neat stories in which a single centre invents civilization and everyone else merely follows the script. Karahan Tepe, seen inside the Tash Tepeler world, becomes less of a standalone riddle and more of a window into how early monumentality can spread and diversify across a landscape. And that in turn changes how we think about its ending, about why someone at some point chose not just to build these places, but to fill them in, cover them, and let the hills go quiet. If you step back from the romance and just look at the dirt, one of the strangest things about this whole world is not that people built these places. It's that, after generations of use, they buried them. At Göbekli Tepe, this is one of the clearest signatures we have. The big enclosures weren't just abandoned to collapse slowly in the weather. They were deliberately backfilled. The spaces between pillars were packed with soil, broken stone, animal bones, fragments of tools. Walls were entombed, floors covered, monuments smoothed back into anonymous mounds. Karahan Tepe, so far as we can see, seems to follow a similar pattern. We don't yet have as detailed a phase-by-phase sequence as at Göbekli, but there is strong evidence that certain built spaces were intentionally infilled rather than simply left to decay. In the dry language of excavation reports, this shows up as rapid, intentional deposition, or structured backfill. In plain language, people came with baskets of material and filled their own sacred architecture up to the brim. That act, consciously erasing your own monument, might be the biggest mystery on the hill. Archaeologists, as you might expect, have not ignored it. The most straightforward class of ideas sees backfilling as part of a ritual cycle. On this view, enclosing a space in stone and then later sealing it with earth and debris are two halves of the same story. You construct a powerful place. It lives for a while in the community's ritual life. Then, at some point, you kill it. You retire it in a controlled way. You bury the old power so that new constructions, new arrangements, new stories can take shape elsewhere. We have parallels for this in later periods. Temples that are ritually closed, shrines that are carefully dismantled or buried when their time is done, houses in some traditional societies that are burned or filled in when their owner dies, turning domestic space into a kind of memorial mound. What gives this hypothesis real traction at Göbekli and, by extension, sites like Karahan is the patterning in the fill. The backfill is not just random hill wash. It includes large quantities of broken but still identifiable objects. Animal bones from feasts, flint tools, fragments of figurines, bits of earlier architecture. It looks a lot more like selected, meaningful refuse from nearby activity areas than like a natural landslide. In that reading, the infilling is an act of transformation. You aren't just hiding the pillars. You're packing the space with the physical memory of what happened there. Meals, tools, offerings, and then sealing it. But ritual closure is only part of the picture, because nothing in human life happens in a vacuum. These hills sit in a world that was changing fast. Karahan Tepe and its neighbours belong to the pre-pottery Neolithic, a time when groups across this region were shifting from highly mobile foraging toward more anchored lives. Not static village farming yet, but more regular returns to particular spots, longer stays in certain seasons, more investment in built structures. Overlay that with climate. The tail end of the Younger Dryas a sharp, cold snap, and the transition into the early Holocene. Warmer, generally wetter, more stable. Over a few centuries, the same landscapes could become more predictable, more forgiving. Plant communities shifted. Animal ranges adjusted. New options opened for people who were already experimenting with cereals, herd management, more intensive use of particular territories. In that context, Backfilling might mark more than a change in ritual fashion. It could track shifts in how people moved, where they gathered, and what counted as a focal place. One line of thought sees the burial of sites like Göbekli and Karahan as part of a move downhill, as fertile lowlands and river valleys became more attractive, better for early cultivation, more reliable for water. Groups might have shifted some of their major gatherings away from exposed upland ridges. If the center of gravity of your social and economic life is migrating toward new, more productive zones, the old hilltop sanctuaries might start to feel less central. You don't simply forget them. You give them an ending. You close them, sometimes elaborately, and consolidate your efforts closer to where you now live and work. Another related idea focuses on social change. These early monumental projects probably required cooperation across multiple bands or lineages. Coordinating labour to quarry, carve, haul and set T-pillars is not a casual weekend project. It implies a social fabric capable of mobilizing people beyond the everyday. If that fabric changes, if alliances shift, if key lineages lose influence, if new leaders favour different styles of gathering or different symbols, it's easy to imagine a scenario where older enclosures become politically charged. Backfilling, in this light, can be a way of neutralizing contested monuments. Rather than letting one group continue to claim special access to a powerful place, the community literally removes it from the landscape. The story remains, but the physical stage is gone. There are also more prosaic pressures. Resource stress, for example. Even in a generally improving climate, local environments can be pushed hard. Overhunting of favoured game near major gathering sites, or overuse of certain plant communities, could have made some hills less attractive as long-term foci. Backfilling might coincide with a practical decision. We can no longer support the same scale of feasts or events here, so which of these explanations is actually backed by the ground? The direct evidence is strongest for two things: that the backfilling was deliberate and comparatively rapid, and that the material used to fill the enclosures came from activity associated with the sites themselves, feasting, tool-making, everyday use around the monuments. The idea of ritual closure, of killing a building, is strongly suggested by that patterning and by cross-cultural comparisons. The links to climate transition, changing mobility, shifting settlement patterns, and resource pressures are more interpretive. They fit what we know from regional environmental data and from the broader spread of Neolithic villages, but they remain hypotheses rather than proven causes for any particular pit of fill. We can say with some confidence that Göbekli Tepe's big enclosures did not simply fall out of use and slowly silt up. People chose to pack them, and then they walked away. For Karahan Tepe, emerging stratigraphy points towards similar intentionality, though the sequence is still being worked out. We cannot yet say exactly why any given enclosure was filled on a particular generation's watch. Before we look ahead to what these choices mean for the story of civilization, a quick pause. If you find yourself wanting to go deeper into these long, quiet histories while you fall asleep, there is a full-length book built from this kind of slow, evidence-based storytelling. You can find it at sleepytimehistory.com, and there's a discount running this week if you want to pick it up. It follows the same calm, curiosity-driven approach you're hearing now, just in page form. Back on the hill, the other major limit we have to live with is simply how much is still underground. At Göbekli Tepe, only a fraction of the mound has been excavated, and already the picture has shifted over time, from an early focus on giant, animal-covered enclosures to a more layered story with later, smaller structures, possible domestic features, and a long history of rebuilding and burying. Karahan Tepe is even less exposed. Those striking heads and chambers are open windows, not a full floor plan. We do not yet know how many phases of construction and infilling lie beneath, or whether there are earlier, more massive or more modest arrangements waiting under the current levels. Each season of work has the potential to complicate the tidy narratives we're tempted to tell now. Maybe we'll find that some spaces were reopened after partial burial. Maybe we'll find evidence that not all structures were filled, that some were allowed to weather naturally while others were sealed with care. Maybe patterns of animal bones in the fill will point toward very specific closing ceremonies, last feasts before the earth was poured in, Or maybe we will discover entirely new types of spaces at Karahan or neighbouring hills that don't fit the Göbekli template at all, forcing us to rethink how uniform this ritual closure really was. For now, we inhabit a productive tension. We know enough to say that backfilling mattered. It was an action, not an accident. It speaks to changing relationships with these stone spaces over time. We don't yet know enough to reduce that action to a single, neat explanation. Any honest account of Karahan Tepe's life cycle has to leave room for multiple scales at once. Ritual logics we only dimly grasp, social negotiations we can infer but not name, climate and resource shifts humming in the background, and the stubborn fact that most of the evidence is still in the ground. The hills went quiet. That much is clear. Exactly how, and exactly why, are still questions in motion, questions that shape how we think about what came next. When people who had once carved heads from bedrock and raised T-pillars on ridges began, instead, to build something new on lower ground. So where does all of this leave us, standing in front of those buried heads and pillars? If we strip things back to what the evidence actually supports, a few themes keep returning. Karahan Tepe sits in a landscape of hills that were not random campsites, but focal points, places people came back to, places they invested in with architecture that went far beyond what a small mobile band would ever need for shelter. The carved heads, the T-shaped pillars, the sunken enclosures with benches and carefully prepared floors, the concentrations of animal bone and worked stone. Taken together, they point strongly toward gathering. Not just any gathering. Organized, repeated, socially meaningful events. One model sees these hills as ritual gathering centers. On this view, communities that spent most of the year scattered in small groups used places like Karahan and Göbekli as periodic magnets. Times when people converged, performed shared ceremonies, renewed alliances, and reaffirmed stories about who they were. The architecture supports that. Semi-subterranean spaces that can hold groups, benches that imply seating and viewing, central pillars that act as focal points. The labour investment itself, the quarrying and carving, becomes part of the ritual life of the community. A second model emphasises feasting and the pull of plenty. Here, the animal bones and food debris are not background noise, but the main event. People may have used these sites as stages for large occasional feasts, moments when stored surplus or seasonally abundant resources were converted into social capital. In that reading, Karahan Tepe is a machine for turning food into relationships. Marriages arranged, disputes settled, knowledge exchanged, ritual obligations fulfilled in the glow of meat shared and drink poured. A third model focuses on social memory and ancestors. On this line of thought, the carved heads, the upright pillars shaped like stylized bodies, the repeated use and eventual burial of enclosures, are all about maintaining a living past. The stone figures become more than decoration. They stand in for important beings, whether mythic animals, protective forces, or remembered dead. The act of building, using, and then carefully burying an enclosure becomes a way of embedding those relationships into the land itself. Karahan, in this view, is not just a ritual centre but a landscape archive, a place where stories, lineages, and obligations are written in limestone and then folded back into the hill. These are models, not settled facts. All of them fit parts of the evidence. None of them captures everything. The strongest ground we have is this. Whatever specific stories people told here, Karahan Tepe and its sister sites show that complex social life, coordinated labour, shared symbols, long-term planning was in full swing thousands of years before settled farming villages and cities. For a long time, the neat story went like this. First agriculture, then surplus, then hierarchy and temples and monuments. You plant fields, you grow more food than you immediately need, and only then can you spare the time and organisation to build big, unnecessary things. Karahan Tepe quietly undermines that sequence. Here, in the window between the younger Dryas and the early Holocene, we see monumental architecture emerging among groups that were still largely hunter-gatherers and early experimenters with cultivation and herding. The monuments come first, or at least very early. That suggests that the desire to gather, to mark special places, to make durable symbols in stone, may have been one of the engines that pulled people toward more settled lives, rather than a byproduct of farming that was already in place. It also reframes what we mean by civilization. If by civilization we mean writing, bureaucrats, and city walls, then these hills are pre-civilizational. But if we mean the deep habits that make those later structures possible, cooperation at scale, shared beliefs maintained over generations, investment in spaces that matter more than any one family, then the roots run right through Karahan. And yet, for all that, the questions still outweigh the answers. Future excavation might tell us whether the carved heads were always buried up to their neck, or whether some originally stood fully exposed before later remodeling. Whether the headroom with the central pillar at Karahan was a unique one-off, or part of a repeated architectural grammar across the Tash Tepe region. Whether residues on stone or microscopic wear on floors and benches can give us more concrete clues about what people actually did in these spaces. Stood in processions, sat to eat, ground grain, performed specific, repeated gestures. Whether DNA from bones in the fills can reveal how wide the catchment was for these events. Were people coming from a few nearby valleys or from much farther away? Whether we'll find clear evidence of early plant management or animal corralling tied directly to these gatherings, tightening the link between monument building and the first steps toward farming. And, perhaps most delicate of all, whether we will ever be able to say with confidence that particular stones were meant to be ancestors, or spirits, or gods, or whether that category itself is too coarse for a world 11,000 years removed from our own. For now, the stone faces mostly answer our questions with their own silence. They ask us to be patient, to hold more than one possibility in mind at once, to resist the urge to flatten their world into tidy narratives that fit our preferences. They remind us that people who had never seen a city or a book could still imagine complex, layered realities, and were willing to carve those realities into rock and then carefully hide them away. Standing at the end of their story, we can only move slowly. If you've drifted with this